At my only daughter's lavish wedding reception, her new husband pointed at my worn suit, laughed in front of his wealthy boss, and introduced me as a worthless loser who lives under old cars. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I just smiled and extended my grease-stained hand. The powerful CEO turned completely pale, bowed his head, grabbed my hand with both of his, and whispered, "It is an honor, sir." Before I tell you how my arrogant son-in-law completely destroyed his own life that night, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe true respect cannot be bought with a fancy suit or a fake smile. My name is Tyrone. I am 69 years old, and for my entire life I believed that hard work and quiet sacrifice were the best ways to show love. Standing in the corner of that massive country club ballroom, I felt like a ghost haunting someone else's dream. The room was dripping with money. There were crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, towering ice sculptures melting on the buffet tables, and waiters in white gloves carrying silver trays of expensive champagne. I stood out like a sore thumb. I was wearing my best church suit, but it was at least 15 years old, slightly faded at the elbows, and completely out of place among the designer tuxedos and silk gowns brushing past me. I watched my daughter Naomi dancing in the center of the room. She looked beautiful in her white dress, laughing and spinning with her new husband, Brent Gallagher. Seeing her smile should have filled my heart with joy, but instead my chest felt heavy with a quiet, lingering sorrow. After my wife Diane passed away 5 years ago, I poured everything I had into Naomi. I spent my days and nights under the hoods of broken-down cars in my small auto repair shop. The grease permanently stained under my fingernails was the price I paid for her college tuition, her designer clothes, and eventually this extravagant wedding. She wanted high society. She wanted a life far away from the smell of motor oil and exhaust fumes. And Brent, a mid-level corporate executive with a loud mouth and a taste for expensive watches, was her ticket into that world, or so she thought. I stayed near a large marble pillar, keeping to myself, not wanting to ruin her perfect pictures. But my quiet isolation was interrupted when I saw Brent walking toward me. He had a smug grin plastered across his face, holding a glass of champagne in one hand. Beside him was an older, distinguished-looking man in an immaculate tailored suit. I recognized the man immediately, though he did not yet realize who I was. His name was William Thorne, the CEO of the massive logistics and warehousing conglomerate where Brent worked. Brent worshipped the ground Thorne walked on, always bragging about his boss and how close he was to getting a major promotion. Brent stopped a few feet away from me, making sure we were standing near a group of his wealthy friends and colleagues. He looked me up and down, his eyes full of pure disgust, as if I were a piece of trash that had somehow blown into the ballroom. He turned to his boss, laughing loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "Mr. Thorne," Brent said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I wanted to introduce you to my new father-in-law. This is Naomi's dad. He is a worthless loser who lives under old cars. Just a small-town mechanic who barely makes enough to keep the lights on." The surrounding guests went completely silent. A few of them chuckled nervously, looking at me with pity. Naomi was standing just a few feet away. She heard every single word her husband said. I looked into my daughter's eyes, hoping she would step forward, hoping she would defend the man who gave up everything for her. But she just looked away, her face flushing with embarrassment, and pretended she did not hear it. That silence from my own flesh and blood hurt worse than any insult Brent could ever throw at me. But I did not get angry. I have lived 69 years as a black man in America. I have dealt with men much more dangerous and much more powerful than a 32-year-old corporate climber with a fragile ego. I kept my posture straight. I looked directly into Brent's smug eyes, then shifted my gaze to William Thorne. I simply smiled, stepped forward, and extended my rough, calloused hand toward the CEO. William Thorne looked at my hand, and then he looked up at my face. It took him exactly 2 seconds to recognize the man standing in front of him. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The color completely drained from Thorne's face, leaving him looking as pale as the tablecloths. His confident corporate posture collapsed. His shoulders dropped, his knees actually bent slightly, and he bowed his head in a gesture of pure submission. He did not just shake my hand. He reached out with both of his hands, grasping my rough fingers as if they were made of gold. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. "It is an honor," Sir Thorne whispered, his voice cracking with genuine fear and deep respect. "I had no idea you would be attending. Please forgive the intrusion." The power dynamic in the room shifted so violently that you could feel the air pressure change. Brent froze. The smug smile slid off his face, replaced by a look of utter confusion. He looked at his powerful boss, the man he feared and respected above all others, bowing to the old mechanic in the faded suit. Thorne did not even look at Brent. He kept his eyes locked on mine, sweating profusely, waiting for my permission to breathe. I gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Thorne swallowed hard, excused himself with a trembling voice, and practically ran away from the table, desperate to put distance between himself and Brent's monumental mistake. Brent stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He could not process what had just happened. His ego refused to accept it. Instead of realizing the massive danger he had just put himself in, Brent's mind desperately tried to rationalize the situation. He convinced himself that Thorne must have mistaken me for someone else, maybe an old janitor from the corporate office or a charity case the company sponsored. The confusion quickly twisted into intense anger. Brent felt embarrassed. His grand moment of humiliating me in front of his wealthy white friends had completely backfired, making him look foolish. His face turned bright red, and he decided to double down on his cruelty. He stepped closer to me, invading my personal space, his breath smelling heavily of expensive liquor. "I do not know what kind of game you are playing, old man," Brent hissed loudly, making sure the entire crowd of guests could hear him clearly. "But you are not going to embarrass me tonight. You have been sitting in the corner drinking my champagne all evening. Since you are so proud you can make yourself useful, I demand you contribute $50,000 to cover the catering right now. You owe me for letting you into this venue. Pay up or get out of my sight." The guests gasped. It was a brutal, impossible demand meant to crush me into the ground. He knew an old mechanic could never produce $50,000. He wanted to watch me break. But as I looked at his arrogant face, knowing the devastating secrets I held, I realized Brent Gallagher had just handed me the shovel he would use to dig his own grave. I looked at Brent, whose face was contorted into a mask of pure entitlement. The lively music in the ballroom seemed to fade into a dull hum, replaced by the collective holding of breath from the wealthy guests surrounding us. They were waiting for the old mechanic to break to apologize or to scramble away in shame. Instead, I adjusted the cuffs of my faded suit and met his furious gaze with absolute calm. "I do not have $50,000 to give you, Brent," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of intimidation. "And even if I did, I would not spend a single dime of it to fund this circus." The absolute tranquility in my response was like a lit match dropped into a powder keg. Brent's jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. The veins in his neck bulged against his tightly fastened silk collar. He had expected me to cower. He wanted a public display of his superiority. By denying him that satisfaction, I had struck a massive blow to his fragile ego. "Fine," Brent spat, his voice shaking with unhinged rage. "If you are going to act like a cheap, useless burden, then you will not be treated like family." He spun around and snapped his fingers at the lead wedding photographer, a frantic young man holding a heavy camera. "You," Brent barked, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. "I want this man cut out of every single family portrait. Do not take a single photo of him for the rest of the night. If he ends up in the background of any shot, you delete it immediately. He does not exist to us anymore." The photographer nodded nervously, stepping back as if I were carrying a contagious disease. I turned my head, searching the crowd for the one person who actually mattered to me. Naomi was standing just a few feet away, her hands clutching the skirt of her incredibly expensive white gown. This was the exact moment a daughter should step forward. This was the moment she should tell her new husband that he had crossed an unforgivable line, that no one disrespects her father in public. I waited for her to defend the man who had given her absolutely everything. Instead, Naomi marched over to me, her eyes flashing with intense irritation rather than loyalty. "Dad, you are completely embarrassing me," she hissed under her breath, making sure her wealthy new friends could not hear her cruel words. "Why do you always have to be so difficult? Brent is right. If you cannot contribute to this wedding, you need to step back and stay out of the way." Her words hit my chest harder than a physical blow. The absolute audacity of her statement echoed in my mind. Contribute. She actually dared to use that word with me. As I looked at my daughter, a flood of memories washed over my silent heartbreak. I remembered working double shifts at the auto shop, breathing in toxic fumes and destroying my back just to pay her tuition at a prestigious private university. I paid for her expensive textbooks, her luxury dorm room, her exclusive sorority fees, and the very wedding dress she was currently wearing. Every single luxury she had ever enjoyed was bought with the grease and sweat from my calloused hands. Yet she stood there glaring at me as if I were an uninvited beggar who had wandered in from the street to ruin her perfect high society fantasy. She acted as if my decades of grueling sacrifice were merely the basic down payment for her love, a debt I owed her simply for existing. "Please, Dad," Naomi whispered coldly, her eyes darting nervously toward Brent. "Just go sit in the back or leave. You are making Brent look bad in front of his important colleagues. You do not belong here." That was the exact moment the illusion shattered entirely. The daughter I had raised, the little girl I had protected with my life, was dead. In her place stood a stranger consumed by greed and vanity, a woman who valued a country club membership over her own flesh and blood. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or make a dramatic scene that would give them the satisfaction of calling me crazy. I simply looked at Naomi one last time, committing her cold, dismissive expression to memory. "You are absolutely right, Naomi," I replied quietly. "I do not belong here." I turned my back on my daughter, her arrogant husband, and the sea of judgmental faces staring at my worn suit. I walked slowly and deliberately across the ballroom, feeling the heavy silence parting the crowd like the Red Sea. No one said a word as I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The valet looked at me with a hint of pity, assuming I was exactly what Brent had called me. I handed him my ticket, tipped him with a crisp $20 bill, and waited for my old Ford truck. Driving home through the empty city streets, I did not shed a single tear. The profound sadness had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp, and terrifying clarity. The blind devotion of a father had been burned away, leaving behind the calculating mind of a man who had built a massive empire from nothing. When I arrived at my modest suburban home, I did not go to sleep. I walked straight into my study, locked the heavy oak door behind me, and opened my secure laptop. The blue light from the screen illuminated my face in the dark room. I pulled up an encrypted messaging application and contacted a top-tier private investigator I kept on permanent retainer for my corporate acquisitions. I needed a full microscopic background check on Brent Gallagher. I wanted to know every dark secret, every hidden bank account, and every dirty lie hiding behind his designer suits and his smug attitude. Less than 3 hours later, a highly classified dossier arrived securely in my inbox. As I read through the digital pages, a cold, dangerous smile spread across my face. Brent was not a successful corporate executive at all. He was a monumental fraud. His lavish lifestyle was completely funded by suffocating toxic debt. He owed over $300,000 to violent underground sports bookies, and his creditors were actively threatening to break his legs if he did not pay them back soon. He drove a leased sports car, lived in a luxury apartment he was 3 months behind on, and was drowning in maxed-out credit card debt. But the final page of the comprehensive report held the most sinister revelation of all. Brent had not married my daughter out of love. He had spent months digging into my background and had discovered a rumor about a massive trust fund I had supposedly set up for Naomi. He married her with the sole intention of manipulating her, seizing total control of that trust fund and using my hard-earned wealth to pay off his criminal debts. He thought he was playing a brilliant game against a foolish, gullible old mechanic. He had absolutely no idea he had just declared war on a billionaire who held the supreme power to obliterate his entire existence. 3 weeks passed in absolute silence. I spent my days at the auto shop, my hands deep in the engines of broken cars, waiting for the inevitable. I knew Brent's desperate financial situation would force his hand, and I knew my daughter would be the bait he used. Sure enough, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the bells above my shop door chimed. I wiped the grease from my hands and walked to the front counter to find Naomi and Brent standing there. They were holding 2 cups of expensive artisan coffee and a box of my favorite pastries from the downtown bakery. The sheer audacity of their performance was almost impressive. Brent wore a tailored casual suit and a smile so painfully fake it looked like it physically hurt his face to maintain. Naomi stepped forward, her eyes wide and innocent, playing the role of the remorseful daughter to absolute perfection. She placed the pastries on the counter and reached out to hug me. I let her wrap her arms around my stiff shoulders, feeling absolutely nothing but cold anticipation. She pulled back her voice, dripping with artificial sweetness, apologizing for the tension at the wedding. She claimed emotions were running high, the stress of the event had gotten to everyone, and they wanted to make things right. Brent stepped up right on cue, offering his hand in a gesture of peace. He apologized profusely, blaming his unacceptable behavior on too much champagne and the immense pressure of his corporate job. He insisted that family was the most important thing in the world and that they wanted to start this new chapter on the right foot. I played my part flawlessly. I smiled warmly, accepted his handshake, and offered them a seat in my small, cluttered office at the back of the shop. The trap was set, and the mice had just walked straight in. Once we were seated in my cramped office surrounded by stacks of old invoices and dusty car parts, the real reason for their visit was quickly revealed. Brent leaned forward, resting his elbows on my battered wooden desk, adopting the serious, commanding tone of a successful businessman. He started talking about a massive, once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity. He claimed he was launching an exclusive tech startup that would revolutionize the logistics industry, leveraging his connections with William Thorne. According to Brent, this venture was guaranteed to yield millions within the first year, but he needed a small amount of liquid capital to finalize the initial software development. Naomi chimed in, her eyes sparkling with rehearsed excitement, telling me how brilliant Brent's business plan was and how this would secure our family's wealth for generations. Brent then reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, placing them gently on my desk. He explained that all his liquid assets were currently tied up in high-yield offshore accounts, meaning he just needed a temporary guarantor to secure a short-term business loan. He looked me right in the eye, his voice dripping with manipulative sincerity, and asked if I would be willing to put up the deed to my humble auto shop as collateral. He promised it was merely a formality, a bureaucratic requirement to satisfy the bank's risk assessment team. He assured me the loan would be paid off in less than 3 months, and as a token of his immense gratitude, he would grant me a 10% equity stake in his new billion-dollar company. He pushed a silver pen across the desk, smiling like a predator who had just cornered a wounded animal. He painted a beautiful picture of family unity and shared prosperity, completely unaware that I already knew he was drowning in $300,000 of violent gambling debt and was desperately trying to throw me to the wolves to save his own skin. I picked up the thick stack of papers, adjusting my posture as I slowly flipped through the pages. I did not need a law degree to see the absolute devastation hidden within the fine print. Behind the complicated legal jargon and the flowery corporate language, the contract was a financial death warrant. I skimmed the paragraphs and immediately spotted the predatory clauses perfectly designed to strip me of everything I owned. The document explicitly stated that if the phantom startup failed to generate immediate revenue, the bank would seize my auto shop, liquidate the property, and hold me personally liable for any remaining debt. Furthermore, buried on page 14 was a transfer of asset power that effectively gave Brent full control over my property the moment my signature hit the paper. He was not asking for collateral. He was executing a calculated legal theft of the only livelihood he thought I possessed, planning to leave me homeless and bankrupt to pay off his criminal bookies. Instead of blowing up, exposing his lies, and throwing them out of my shop, I let out a heavy, tired sigh. I squinted hard at the documents, pulling them close to my face and rubbing my eyes as if the text were blurring together. I apologized, complaining that my vision was not what it used to be, and that my old reading glasses were sitting in my locker in the back storage room. Brent eagerly encouraged me to take my time, his eyes practically glowing with greedy anticipation. I stood up, taking the contract with me, and walked into the dark storage area. Once out of their sight, my frail old man persona vanished instantly. I opened my secure locker and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside was a heavily modified version of that exact same contract, flawlessly reconstructed by my corporate shark of a lawyer, Michael Rosenthal. I had anticipated Brent's exact move the moment my private investigator uncovered his debts. Michael had altered the fine print with brutal precision. The new clauses dictated that by executing the loan, Brent forfeited all his personal assets, waived all rights to bankruptcy protection, and legally bound himself to insurmountable financial penalties payable directly to my holding company if a single payment was missed. I seamlessly swapped the documents, walked back into my office wearing my old reading glasses, and sat down. I looked at my daughter and her deceitful husband, offering them a warm, trusting smile. I took the silver pen, signed my name on the dotted line without hesitation, and handed the lethal contract back to Brent. He eagerly snatched the paperwork, grinning like he had just won the lottery, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just signed his own financial death warrant. The very next morning, the trap I had so carefully set snapped shut with devastating precision. I was sitting in my auto shop, wiping down a carburetor, when my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a secure call from Michael Rosenthal, my lead corporate attorney. Michael was not just a lawyer, he was a shark who thrived on destroying arrogant men like my son-in-law. He called to give me a play-by-play of Brent's spectacular humiliation at the First National Commercial Bank downtown. According to Michael, whose firm held massive sway over that particular branch, Brent had swaggered into the loan officer's suite like he owned the building. He tossed my signed contract onto the polished mahogany desk, demanding an immediate cash advance against the collateral of my auto shop. He expected a quick signature and a massive wire transfer to satisfy his violent creditors. Instead, he got a brutal wake-up call. The senior loan officer, a meticulous woman with decades of experience, began reading the document. Within 2 minutes, her polite corporate smile vanished. She adjusted her glasses and read the clauses Michael had masterfully embedded in the fine print. She looked up at Brent, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to outright amusement. She informed him that not only was my auto shop completely shielded from any liens, but the contract he had so eagerly presented actually listed all of his personal assets, his leased sports car, his bank accounts, and his future wages as the sole collateral. Furthermore, the document explicitly stated that Brent waived all rights to bankruptcy protection. He was completely and entirely liable for the phantom startup loan. The loan officer slid the useless paperwork back across the desk and told him in no uncertain terms that the bank would not give him a single dime. She essentially laughed him out of the executive suite. Brent had walked in expecting to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars off my back. He walked out with absolutely nothing, sweating profusely, realizing his brilliant scam had been entirely neutralized by what he thought was a senile mistake. It did not take long for the fallout to reach my front door. Less than an hour later, the quiet peace of my suburban home was shattered. The front door banged open so violently it rattled the picture frames on the walls. Brent stormed into my living room, his face flushed a dark, angry purple, his tie loosened and his expensive suit jacket wrinkled. Naomi was right on his heels, her face twisted into a mask of pure, self-righteous fury. Brent slammed the rejected contract down on my coffee table, pointing a shaking finger at my face. He began screaming, his voice echoing through the small house. He accused me of being a senile old fool, claiming my failing eyesight had caused me to sign the wrong page or mess up the legal addendums. He shrieked that my incompetence had ruined a multi-million-dollar deal and humiliated him in front of top-tier bankers. I sat in my worn armchair, maintaining my frail, confused facade. I spoke softly, telling him I simply signed exactly where he told me to sign, asking if there was some sort of misunderstanding. Instead of calming down, Naomi stepped forward and directed her rage entirely at me. My own daughter stood in my living room and yelled at the top of her lungs. She called me a useless burden, screaming that I ruined everything I touched. She said my ignorance was holding her husband back from true success and dragging their reputation through the mud. She demanded I fix the paperwork immediately, or she would never forgive me. The sheer venom in her voice was staggering. They stormed out of the house just as quickly as they had arrived, slamming the door behind them, leaving me in the quiet living room to absorb the sheer magnitude of their disrespect. The true depth of their desperation, however, would not be revealed until the sun went down. That night I sat alone in the dark of my home office. The silence of the house was absolute, save for the faint hum of my encrypted security server. Over the years, I had wired my entire property with hidden high-definition cameras feeding directly into a secure monitor on my desk. At exactly 2 in the morning, a motion sensor alert flashed on my screen. I watched the live feed as the side door of my house opened with a quiet click. A figure slipped into the hallway, moving stealthily through the shadows. The infrared camera illuminated her face clearly. It was Naomi. My heart, already bruised by the events of the afternoon, cracked completely. My own flesh and blood was sneaking into my home like a common thief in the dead of night. I watched through the monitor as she crept directly toward my old home office. She bypassed the modern electronics and headed straight for the heavy rusted steel safe bolted to the floor in the corner of the room. It was an old safe, one I had kept since she was a little girl. She knelt on the floor and reached for the dial. I felt a sickening twist in my stomach as I watched her input the combination. The numbers she turned were her own birth date. I had used that combination out of love, a sentimental fatherly gesture, and now she was using that exact same sentiment to rob me blind. The heavy steel door swung open with a quiet groan. Naomi completely ignored the small stacks of emergency cash and the velvet boxes of her late mother's jewelry. She knew exactly what Brent had sent her to find. Her hands rummaged through the hanging folders until she pulled out a thick, official-looking document. It was the original physical deed to my auto shop. She quickly shoved the heavy parchment into her designer leather bag, closed the safe, spun the dial to lock it, and hurried back out the way she came. I sat in the glow of the security monitor, the cold blue light reflecting the profound sorrow on my face. She thought she had just stolen my most valuable asset. She believed she was handing her husband the key to seizing my property, completely unaware that the physical piece of paper was absolutely worthless. The actual legal ownership of the shop had been transferred to an airtight corporate holding company decades ago. But the monetary value of the paper did not matter. The emotional cost was absolute. My daughter had just proven that there was no line she would not cross, no betrayal she would not commit to serve a man who was using her. She had chosen to steal from her father to feed a parasite. As I backed up the security footage to a secure drive, the last lingering trace of my fatherly leniency vanished. The time for playing the weak, confused old man was drawing to a close. Let them try to use that stolen deed. I was ready to watch them hang themselves. What are your thoughts on this next step? I woke up the next morning with the heavy knowledge of my daughter's betrayal settling into my bones. I did not call the police. I did not storm over to her apartment and demand the stolen paper back. I simply made my coffee, went to my shop, and waited for their next move. The physical deed she stole was absolutely worthless, but her actions proved she was fully committed to her husband's scam. I wanted to see how far the Gallagher family was willing to go. I did not have to wait long. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was not Brent or Naomi. It was Gregory Gallagher, the father of Brent. He spoke with the booming, overly confident voice of a man who believed his money made him invincible. He invited me to a formal family dinner at their sprawling country club estate that evening. He claimed it was time the two families finally sat down to discuss the future. I knew exactly what this was. It was a coordinated ambush. They believed they held all the cards and wanted to assert their dominance. I accepted the invitation without hesitation. I washed the grease off my hands, put on a clean but faded button-down shirt and a pair of simple slacks, and climbed into my beaten-up 1998 Ford truck. I drove across town, leaving the industrial neighborhoods behind, and pulled up to the massive wrought-iron gates of the Gallagher estate. The property was an ostentatious display of wealth, featuring towering columns, manicured hedges, and luxury vehicles parked in the circular driveway. The valet looked at my old truck with absolute disdain, unsure if he should even touch it. I handed him the keys with a polite nod and walked up the wide marble steps. I was ready to step into the lion's den. A uniformed housekeeper opened the heavy oak doors, leading me into a massive dining room dripping with crystal and gold accents. Gregory and his wife Evelyn stood at the head of a long mahogany table. Brent and Naomi sat on one side, both dressed to the nines, deliberately avoiding my gaze. Gregory stepped forward and offered a stiff, overly firm handshake, a classic intimidation tactic. He gestured for me to sit at the far end of the table, physically isolating me from the rest of the group. As the kitchen staff served plates of roasted duck and expensive wine, the psychological warfare began. The conversation was not a friendly family catch-up. It was a calculated sequence of insults disguised as polite curiosity. Evelyn swirled her wine glass and looked at me with a patronizing smile. She loudly wondered how a man my age could tolerate the physical toll of a blue-collar existence. She commented that it must be terribly exhausting to spend every single day surrounded by dirt oil and lower-class clientele. Gregory chimed in, adding that they always admired people who were willing to do the menial labor that kept the city running. Their tone was dripping with racial and classist undertones, carefully crafted to make me feel small, uneducated, and completely out of place in their pristine white world. They praised Naomi, calling her a miracle for rising so far above her humble, disadvantaged upbringing to marry into a family of their stature. Naomi simply stared at her plate, nodding slightly silently, agreeing with the people who were insulting her own father right to his face. Brent sat back with a smug, self-satisfied smirk, clearly enjoying the spectacle. They wanted me to lash out. They wanted the angry, uneducated black mechanic to raise his voice and prove every terrible stereotype they held about me. Instead, I calmly cut. My duck tasted the expensive wine and offered nothing but polite, measured responses. I watched them perform their wealth, knowing full well the truth hidden in the private investigator file sitting on my desk. I knew their entire country club lifestyle was a precarious house of cards built on suffocating high-interest loans. I let them talk, absorbing every insult, fueling the cold fire burning in my chest. Once the plates were cleared and dessert was served, the false pleasantries abruptly ended. Gregory cleared his throat, leaned heavily on the table, and adopted the tone of a ruthless negotiator. He stated that Brent and Naomi were destined for the upper echelons of society. He claimed Brent was on the fast track to a massive corporate promotion and that their family reputation had to remain absolutely flawless. Then he looked at me with a gaze as cold as ice. He told me that my presence, my auto shop, and my general aesthetic were a severe liability to their social standing. He reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out a sleek leather checkbook, and quickly scribbled on a page. He tore the check loose and slid it face up across the long mahogany table until it rested right next to my coffee cup. It was a check for $100,000. Gregory folded his hands and delivered his ultimate demand. He told me to take the money sign, the auto shop, entirely over to Brent and permanently relocate to a retirement community in Florida. He explicitly demanded that I disappear from my daughter's life so I would no longer embarrass the Gallagher family name. He called it a generous severance package for my past efforts, emphasizing that a mechanic like me would never see that kind of money in a single lifetime. Brent let out a quiet chuckle, looking at me as if I were a stray dog being thrown a juicy bone. Naomi finally looked up, her eyes pleading with me to just take the money and leave. They genuinely believed they were buying my entire existence for pennies. I looked down at the check resting on the polished wood. $100,000. To the man they thought I was, it was a fortune. To the man I actually am, it was less than the daily interest generated by my offshore investment portfolios. I did not yell. I did not tear the check into pieces or throw a dramatic tantrum. I calmly picked up a linen napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and stood up from the table. I pushed the check back toward Gregory, offering the entire table a warm, completely genuine smile. "I appreciate the wonderful meal," I said, my voice steady and commanding. "But you should keep your money, Gregory. You are going to need every single cent of it very soon." I turned my back on their shocked faces and walked out of the opulent dining room, leaving the mansion without another word. The night air felt incredibly refreshing as I walked down the grand driveway to my old truck. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and pulled out my encrypted mobile phone. I dialed my lawyer, Michael. He answered on the first ring. "Michael," I said, staring up at the brightly lit mansion. "I want you to contact our primary investment firm immediately. Buy up every single piece of over-leveraged debt belonging to the Gallagher family. Their mortgages, their business loans, their credit lines. By tomorrow morning, I want to legally own the roof over their heads." The morning after the dinner at the Gallagher estate, the sun rose over my auto shop exactly as it always did. I arrived at 6 in the morning, brewed my usual pot of cheap black coffee, and sat at my battered wooden desk. But I was not there to review parts orders or schedule oil changes. I opened my encrypted laptop and initiated a secure video conference with my primary wealth management team in Zurich. For years, I had quietly funded an extensive trust account for Naomi. I had also been paying off 2 high-limit supplementary black credit cards she used for her designer clothes, luxury vacations, and expensive dinners. She always assumed she was just incredibly good at budgeting her meager salary, completely blind to the fact that I was silently subsidizing her entire high society lifestyle from the shadows. I looked at the lead asset manager on the screen and gave a single definitive order. I told him to completely freeze Naomi's trust fund effective immediately. Furthermore, I instructed him to permanently cancel every single supplementary credit card linked to my corporate holding companies. The wealth manager nodded respectfully, his fingers flying across his keyboard. Within 60 seconds, the financial umbilical cord was officially severed. It was a deeply painful moment for a father. Cutting off your own child goes against every protective instinct in your body. I had spent my entire life trying to shield her from the harsh realities of the world, but I knew this was no longer about protection. It was a necessary amputation to save her from the parasite she had married. The money supply was completely dry, and I knew the reaction would be explosive. The fallout was swift and absolutely spectacular. I did not have to wait long to see the results of my morning directive. Just before noon, my phone rang. It was Michael calling with a highly entertaining update from my private investigator who had been tailing Brent all morning. Michael could barely contain his amusement as he relayed the scene unfolding at an exclusive luxury car dealership across town. Brent, operating under the delusion that he had successfully intimidated me into submission at dinner the night before, had decided to celebrate his impending windfall. He had swaggered into the high-end showroom dressed in a custom-tailored suit, demanding the immediate purchase of a brand-new Porsche 911 Turbo. He treated the sales staff like absolute garbage, snapping his fingers, demanding sparkling water, and acting as if he owned the entire building while he picked out a custom leather interior. When it came time to finalize the massive down payment, Brent confidently pulled out the black supplementary card he had recently confiscated from Naomi's purse. He slapped it onto the sales manager's glass desk with maximum arrogance, expecting a seamless transaction to match his inflated ego. The sales manager swiped the card. Declined. Brent scoffed, blaming their machine, and demanded they run it again. Declined. The manager politely informed him that the account had been completely frozen by the primary cardholder. Brent panicked, his face flushing a bright, embarrassing shade of crimson. He frantically pulled out his own personal credit cards, the ones already maxed out from his suffocating underground gambling debts. Every single card he presented was instantly rejected. The entire showroom went dead silent. The sales staff, who had been enduring his arrogant abuse for the past hour, began to openly smirk. Other wealthy customers turned to watch the spectacle. Brent started screaming at the manager, cursing the banking system and aggressively claiming he was a high-level executive who made millions. But the sales manager simply slid the worthless plastic back across the desk, signaled for security, and politely asked him to leave the premises. Brent walked out of the dealership completely empty-handed, his dignity shattered into 1,000 pieces in front of the exact type of high society crowd he so desperately wanted to impress. It took less than 30 minutes for his public humiliation to violently redirect itself toward my front door. I was standing in the main bay of my shop, calmly wiping thick black grease off a heavy steel wrench, when Brent's leased sports car skidded recklessly into my gravel parking lot. He slammed the car door so hard the windows rattled in their frames. He marched into my garage looking like a completely deranged madman. His expensive suit jacket was thrown open, his tie was yanked sideways, and his eyes were wide with unhinged fury. Without saying a single word, he kicked over a heavy red metal toolbox. Sockets, bolts, and screwdrivers clattered loudly across the concrete floor. He kicked a stack of tires, screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with rage. He demanded to know exactly what I had done to Naomi's bank accounts. He yelled that I had intentionally humiliated him in public, that I was ruining his life, and that I had absolutely no right to cut off the money that rightfully belonged to his wife. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or step back. I simply stood my ground, slowly polishing my wrench with a dirty rag, watching him throw a violent temper tantrum like a spoiled, overgrown child. I let him scream until his lungs gave out. When he finally paused to catch his breath, I told him calmly that my money was my own, and I was no longer interested in funding a grown man who openly referred to me as a worthless loser. Brent stopped kicking the tools and stepped uncomfortably close to me, invading my personal space. The frantic anger in his eyes suddenly hardened into something cold, calculated, and deeply sinister. He lowered his voice to a menacing whisper, dropping all pretense of family loyalty or basic respect. He told me that I was a stubborn, foolish old man who clearly did not understand how the real world worked. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and delivered a chilling ultimatum. He gave me exactly 48 hours to march down to the bank and completely unlock Naomi's trust fund. If I refused to comply, he promised to unleash a team of ruthless corporate lawyers to legally declare me medically unfit to manage my own life. He claimed he had already laid the groundwork with medical professionals to prove I was suffering from severe senile dementia and dangerous paranoia. He swore he would seize full legal guardianship of my entire estate, throw me into a miserable, underfunded state-run nursing home, and take absolute control of every single asset I owned. He smirked, turned on his heel, and walked out of my shop, leaving me with a threat that crossed the line from simple disrespect to outright psychological warfare. The very next morning, the silence of my suburban home was broken by the sound of tires crunching on gravel. I checked my security monitor and saw Brent's leased sports car pull into my driveway. He was not alone. Naomi stepped out of the passenger side looking tense, and from the back seat emerged a tall, gaunt man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit carrying a worn leather briefcase. I recognized the type instantly. This was the hired gun Brent had threatened me with, the corrupt medical professional, willing to sell his ethics to the highest bidder. They marched up to my front porch and rang the bell, adopting the fake concerned posture of a family desperately trying to save a confused old man. I opened the door dressed in my faded flannel shirt, playing the role of the frail mechanic perfectly. Brent pushed his way inside without waiting for an invitation, his false confidence returning. He introduced the gaunt man as Dr. Vance, claiming he was a highly respected specialist they had brought over for a simple wellness check. Naomi chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy, telling me they were just so worried about my recent erratic behavior and the severe stress I was under. They wanted to make sure my mind was still sharp enough to handle the pressures of running a business. Dr. Vance offered a slimy, condescending smile, shaking my hand and insisting this was merely a routine conversation to evaluate my cognitive health. I led them into my living room, gesturing toward the armchairs. The trap they thought they were setting was about to snap violently shut on their own fingers. As we sat down, Dr. Vance immediately launched into his rehearsed interrogation. He did not perform a genuine medical evaluation. He bypassed standard cognitive tests and went straight for manipulative leading questions designed to paint a specific damning picture. He asked me if I often felt paranoid that people were stealing from me. He questioned if I sometimes forgot where I placed important legal documents, specifically mentioning the deed to my auto shop. He pressed me on my decision to cut off Naomi's financial support, framing it as an irrational, impulsive act, typical of advancing dementia. Brent sat back, nodding approvingly while Naomi pretended to wipe away a fake tear. They were trying to establish a legally binding medical record that I was suffering from severe paranoia and memory loss, creating the perfect foundation to strip me of my autonomy and seize guardianship of my estate. I sat quietly listening to the doctor weave his web of lies. When he finally paused, expecting me to stumble over my words or act confused, I simply smiled. I reached out and tapped a small, inconspicuous radio transmitter sitting on the end table next to my chair. Before Brent or Naomi could even process the gesture, the heavy oak door leading to my kitchen swung open. My lead corporate attorney, Michael Rosenthal, stepped into the living room, his sharp eyes fixed entirely on Dr. Vance. He was not alone. Behind him walked two stern-looking men wearing official badges from the State Medical Licensing Board. The color instantly drained from Dr. Vance's face. Brent jumped out of his chair, his aggressive swagger completely evaporating. I looked directly at the corrupt doctor and informed him that our entire conversation had been recorded using high-definition audio and video equipment. I explained that my legal team had thoroughly investigated his background the moment Brent issued his threat, uncovering a long history of selling fraudulent diagnoses for cash. Michael stepped forward, handing a thick folder directly to the medical board investigators. He coldly informed the doctor that his unethical ambush had just provided the final piece of evidence needed to permanently revoke his medical license and initiate a criminal investigation for medical fraud and extortion. Panic erupted in my living room. Dr. Vance grabbed his briefcase, stammering incoherently, and practically ran for the front door, leaving his wealthy clients behind to face the consequences. Brent's face turned completely white. He looked at the investigators, looked at my shark of a lawyer, and then looked at me, realizing the monumental trap he had just walked into. Naomi grabbed Brent's arm, terror flashing in her eyes, as the reality of the situation crashed down upon her. Without saying another word, they turned and fled my house, scrambling into their sports car and speeding away like terrified rats fleeing a sinking ship. They thought they were bringing a medical hitman to destroy my life, but all they did was confirm to the authorities that they were actively conspiring to commit severe elder abuse. The spectacular failure of their medical ambush left Brent with absolutely nowhere to hide. My private investigator, still tracking his every move, intercepted frantic communications later that afternoon. Brent was completely out of time. The underground sports bookies holding his $300,000 debt had lost their patience. They sent 2 enforcers to his luxury apartment complex, making their presence known by violently smashing the windshield of his leased Porsche. The message was unmistakable. If he did not produce a massive cash payment by sunrise, they were going to break a lot more than just the glass on his car. Cornered, humiliated, and completely cut off from Naomi's trust fund, Brent's arrogance finally gave way to pure feral desperation. He could no longer rely on legal loopholes, forged documents, or corrupt doctors. He had to resort to crude physical criminality. He knew my auto shop housed thousands of dollars in high-end diagnostic computers, specialized mechanic tools, and a heavy iron cash register that usually held the weekly operating float. In his panic-stricken mind, he figured a quick midnight burglary would solve his immediate crisis and keep the bookies at bay just long enough for him to formulate another scam. He assumed my shop was just a dilapidated old building protected by a cheap padlock and a rusty chain. He thought he was outsmarting a helpless old man one last time. He had absolutely no idea he was preparing to break into a fortress. At exactly 2 a.m, the heavy rain outside my shop masked the sound of Brent's arrival. I was sitting comfortably in my home office, sipping a cup of hot black tea, watching the live security feed on my encrypted monitors. Brent parked his damaged sports car 2 blocks away and crept through the dark industrial alleyway wearing a black hooded sweatshirt and carrying a heavy steel crowbar. He looked exactly like the desperate, pathetic criminal he had truly become. He approached the side entrance of my shop, the reinforced glass door that led directly into the main service bay. Without a second of hesitation, he swung the crowbar with all his might. The glass shattered violently, spraying sharp shards across the concrete floor. Brent reached through the jagged opening, unlocked the deadbolt, and pushed his way inside. He immediately pulled out a flashlight, sweeping the narrow beam over my workstations. He moved frantically, driven by pure panic and the looming threat of the men waiting for their money. He ignored the heavy engine parts and headed straight for the secure storage cabinets where I kept the advanced digital diagnostic scanners. These were highly specialized, expensive machines worth tens of thousands of dollars on the black market. He smashed the padlock on the cabinet, violently ripping the protective foam cases from the shelves and throwing them into a large canvas duffel bag he had brought with him. Next, he sprinted toward the front office, targeting my vintage cash register. He swung the crowbar again, smashing the register dial and forcing the drawer open. He scooped up the small bundles of petty cash, shoving the crumpled bills into his pockets with shaking hands. He was breathing heavily, a chaotic mess of adrenaline and fear, convinced he had just pulled off the perfect heist against a naive old man. He hoisted the heavy duffel bag over his shoulder and turned back toward the shattered side door, ready to make his grand escape. He took exactly 3 steps toward his exit before the reality of my world crashed down upon him. My modest, grease-stained auto shop was not an independent, run-down garage. It was legally registered as a secure asset under my global logistics conglomerate. The building was directly wired into the same military-grade security grid that protected my billion-dollar corporate warehouses on the East Coast. The moment he smashed that glass, silent alarms had instantly triggered a protocol designed to neutralize armed intruders. I sat at my desk, looking at the high-definition security feed and calmly pressed a single red key on my laptop. A deafening mechanical roar echoed through the shop. Solid reinforced steel shutters plummeted from the ceiling at terrifying speed, violently slamming into the concrete floor and sealing every single window and door. The heavy metallic crash shook the entire building. Brent dropped his duffel bag in shock, spinning around wildly as the perimeter locked down. High-intensity strobe lights flooded the main bay, blinding him instantly with disorienting flashes. Then the piercing shriek of a 120-decibel corporate security siren erupted, bouncing off the concrete walls with physically painful force. Brent stumbled backward, covering his ears, trapped like a rat in a steel cage. He ran to the shattered side door and desperately pounded his fists against the immovable steel shutter, screaming in sheer terror. He threw his body against the metal, but it did not even dent. The illusion of his superiority vanished completely as the automated defenses of a billionaire's empire swallowed him whole. He was completely sealed inside a vault of his own making. The automated security system had already dispatched a priority alert directly to the local police department, flagging the breach as a high-level corporate intrusion. Less than 4 minutes later, a fleet of police cruisers swarmed the perimeter of my shop, their red and blue lights flashing intensely against the wet pavement. Heavily armed officers surrounded the building, establishing a tactical perimeter and demanding the intruder surrender. I watched the entire spectacle unfold in absolute silence from the comfort of my home office monitor, taking another calm sip of my tea. I watched as the automated system slowly raised the front bay shutter, exposing a terrified, weeping Brent Gallagher to a dozen drawn service weapons. The strobe lights washed over his pale face as he dropped to his knees on the grease-stained concrete, sobbing uncontrollably as the officers slammed him face down and locked heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. He had tried to strip me of everything I owned, and in return I simply sat back and watched him completely destroy his own freedom. What aspects of Tyrone's calculated revenge did you find most satisfying in this segment? The sun had barely risen over the quiet suburban streets when the frantic pounding on my front door began. I was standing in the kitchen, calmly waiting for my old coffee pot to finish brewing the events of the previous night, perfectly secured on multiple encrypted drives. The knocking grew violently louder, accompanied by the muffled sound of a woman crying hysterically. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, set the mug down on the counter, and walked to the entryway. When I opened the heavy wooden door, Naomi practically collapsed into my foyer. The polished high society facade she had so carefully maintained since her wedding was completely gone. Her designer clothes were wrinkled. Her hair was a tangled mess, and mascara ran in dark, messy streaks down her cheeks. She was hyperventilating, sobbing uncontrollably as she grabbed the sleeves of my faded flannel shirt. She cried that the police had called her in the middle of the night. She said Brent was sitting in a holding cell at the county jail facing serious felony charges for breaking and entering destruction of property and attempted grand larceny. She looked up at me with wide, desperate eyes, expecting the old, reliable mechanic to instantly melt at the sight of his little girl's tears. She begged me to pick up my phone and call the police precinct right then and there. She demanded I tell the detectives that the entire situation was just a massive misunderstanding. She wanted me to lie to armed officers and claim I had given Brent the keys, that he had full permission to be inside my shop at 2 a.m. with a crowbar, and that the alarm system had simply malfunctioned. She clung to my arms, pleading with me to drop all the charges and make this terrifying nightmare go away before the local news stations got a hold of the arrest records. I stood perfectly still, letting her pour out her frantic tears, feeling absolutely no urge to comfort her. I did not wrap my arms around her. I did not tell her everything would be all right. I just stared down at the woman who had sneaked into my home office just days earlier to rob my safe, watching her play the victim. When Naomi finally paused to catch her breath, waiting for my reassurance, she was met with a wall of absolute silence. I slowly reached up, detached her trembling hands from my shirt, and took a deliberate step back. The lack of paternal warmth was a shock to her system. The fake, desperate tears instantly dried up, replaced by a sudden, ugly flash of defensive rage. The mask of the scared wife fell away, and the entitled, spoiled monster I had inadvertently created reared its head. If I was not going to play the role of the subservient savior, she decided I was going to be the villain. She squared her shoulders and began screaming at me, her voice echoing off the walls of my living room. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest and blamed me for the entire ordeal. She shrieked that if I had not been so cruel, if I had not maliciously frozen her trust fund and canceled her credit cards, Brent never would have been forced to take such desperate measures. She twisted the reality of his violent burglary into a noble sacrifice, claiming he was only trying to protect their family from the financial ruin I had supposedly caused. She called me a terrible, vindictive father who was actively trying to destroy her happiness out of pure jealousy. Then she crossed a line from which there was absolutely no return. Her face contorted with intense, venomous disgust as she compared my worth to her criminal husband. She yelled that Brent was an educated white man with a promising corporate career and a flawless country club reputation to uphold. She screamed that his entire future, his social standing, and his professional network would be permanently ruined if he went to a federal prison over my worthless, dirty junk shop. She actually stood in my home and prioritized her husband's racial and class privilege over my safety, my property, and my life. She demanded to know why I was making such a massive deal out of a few broken windows and some greasy old car parts. In her twisted classist mindset, the livelihood of a black mechanic was entirely disposable, a cheap sacrifice that should gladly be laid at the altar of her white husband's corporate image. She expected me to happily absorb the cost of a violent break-in simply to protect the social reputation of a man who openly referred to me as a loser. She yelled that I was a selfish, bitter old man who did not understand how the real world worked, demanding once again that I pick up the phone and fix the mess I had allegedly created. I looked at the woman screaming in my living room, searching her face for any remaining trace of the little girl I had raised. There was nothing left. The daughter I had sacrificed my entire life to protect had been entirely consumed by arrogance, greed, and a sickening superiority complex. The very last thread of my paternal leniency, the final instinct to protect my child from the consequences of her own actions, snapped cleanly and permanently. I did not raise my voice to match hers. I spoke with a quiet, icy authority that instantly silenced her rant. I told her I would not make a single phone call, I would not lie to the authorities, and I would absolutely not drop the charges. I calmly stated that Brent made his own choice when he picked up a crowbar and smashed my glass, just as she made her choice when she cracked my safe in the dead of night. I walked past her, opened my front door wide, and pointed toward her car parked in my driveway. I told her she was no longer welcome in my home and ordered her to leave immediately. The absolute coldness in my eyes terrified her. She finally realized with crushing certainty that she held zero power over me. She backed out of the house, trembling with genuine fear, completely alone. With my absolute refusal to drop the charges, the legal system came down on Brent with crushing force. Because the security system he triggered was tied directly to my corporate logistics network, the district attorney elevated the burglary to a high-level commercial felony. The judge deemed him a significant flight risk and set his bail at an astronomical amount. Brent was completely broke and Naomi's accounts were frozen solid. Desperate to keep their son out of a violent county jail cell, Brent's arrogant parents, Gregory and Evelyn, were forced to suffer the ultimate humiliation. They had to visit a high-interest bail bondsman and legally mortgage their sprawling country club mansion just to scrape together the cash to buy his temporary freedom. The scent of stale jailhouse bleach and cheap county soap was completely masked by the heavy layer of expensive designer cologne Brent had drenched himself in that morning. After his arrogant parents had mortgaged their luxurious country club estate to secure his exorbitant bail, Brent had not gone home to hide in shame. Instead, he had showered, put on his sharpest tailored suit, tightened his silk tie, and marched directly into the towering glass skyscraper that housed our international corporate headquarters. I was already inside the building, sitting quietly in the executive suite, receiving live updates from my corporate security team as Brent strutted through the main lobby. He walked past the marble security desk with his usual arrogant swagger, flashing his corporate badge as if he still owned the world. In his incredibly twisted and narcissistic mind, he genuinely believed that his arrest was just a temporary administrative hiccup. He figured that because the auto shop was technically registered to a commercial logistics network, his beloved CEO, William Thorne, would view the police involvement as an overblown misunderstanding caused by a faulty security grid. Brent fully expected to walk into the executive offices and have Thorne deploy our elite army of corporate defense attorneys to crush the local district attorney, make the felony charges vanish into thin air, and restore his pristine reputation. He viewed himself as an untouchable, indispensable asset to the firm, a high-level executive whose brilliant business acumen placed him far above the legal consequences of breaking into a dirty, rundown garage. He stepped onto the private elevator reserved for senior management, adjusting his hair in the mirrored walls, completely blind to the fact that he was riding directly into an execution chamber. When the elevator doors chimed open on the top floor, Brent was immediately intercepted by Thorne's executive assistant. She did not offer him a warm greeting, a cup of coffee, or her usual polite smile. With a face like stone, she informed him that an emergency board meeting had been convened in the primary glass conference room, and that his presence was required immediately. Brent adjusted his cuffs and smirked. He honestly thought this was a high-level crisis management meeting called to protect his valuable image and strategize against the press. He walked through the heavy glass doors of the boardroom with his head held high, completely prepared to charm his way out of a felony burglary charge. The massive room was entirely silent. The entire senior executive board sat around the long mahogany table, their expressions grim and unreadable. William Thorne stood at the head of the table, his hands planted firmly on the polished wood, his face red with barely contained fury. Brent offered a charismatic, dismissive smile and opened his mouth, casually apologizing for the weekend mix-up with the local authorities. He tried to laugh it off, waving his hand as if breaking into a building with a crowbar in the dead of night was just a funny anecdote to share over morning coffee. Thorne cut him off with a voice that cracked like a whip. Thorne did not offer him legal protection, a promotion, or a single ounce of sympathy. In front of the most powerful executives in the city, Thorne demanded Brent surrender his corporate badge immediately. He systematically dismantled Brent's entire career, declaring that his violent criminal actions had brought severe liability and unforgivable disgrace to the conglomerate. Thorne officially terminated Brent's employment for gross misconduct and a complete violation of corporate ethics. He coldly informed the now terrified young man that the company would not provide a single lawyer for his defense, and that the corporate legal team had already handed over all of Brent's internal communications and building access logs to the federal prosecutors. Brent stood frozen, his arrogant smile melting into an expression of sheer panic. He began to stammer, aggressively arguing with his CEO. He demanded to know why a multi-billion-dollar company was abandoning its top sales director over a worthless, pathetic mechanic and his garbage-filled junk shop. Thorne shook his head in absolute disgust, looking at Brent as if he were looking at a cockroach. Thorne told him that his ignorance was staggering and that he had absolutely no idea whose property he had vandalized, whose security grid he had triggered, or whose family he had manipulated. Thorne gestured toward the far end of the long mahogany table. The heavy leather chair reserved exclusively for the chairman of the board had been turned away, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. I placed my hands on the armrests and slowly swiveled the chair around to face the room. I was no longer wearing my faded flannel shirt or my oil-stained work boots. I was wearing an immaculate, custom-tailored Tom Ford suit. A brilliant platinum watch gleamed on my wrist. I sat with the absolute unyielding authority of a man who commanded a global empire. Brent stopped breathing, His eyes bulged out of his head, darting frantically between my face and Thorne's rigid posture. Thorne formally introduced me to the ex-employee. He did not introduce me as Naomi's father or as a suburban mechanic. Thorne presented me as the founder, the majority shareholder, and the supreme chairman of the entire international logistics conglomerate. The reality of his monumental stupidity hit Brent with actual physical force. The worthless loser he had publicly insulted at his wedding, the fragile old man he had tried to swindle out of a property, and the mechanic whose shop he had violently burglarized was the exact same billionaire who signed his paychecks and owned his entire existence. His legs gave way completely. Brent physically collapsed onto the expensive carpet of the boardroom, gasping for air as his entire world disintegrated into ash. The shock wave of Brent collapsing in the boardroom was only the beginning of the absolute destruction I had orchestrated. While my former son-in-law was being escorted out of my corporate headquarters by armed security, an entirely different kind of execution was taking place at the sprawling country club estate of Gregory and Evelyn Gallagher. For years, they had paraded around high society looking down their noses at working-class people while financing their lavish lifestyle with suffocating high-interest loans. They had mortgaged their home to the absolute limit just to post Brent's exorbitant bail, completely unaware that they were signing their own financial death warrant. At precisely 10 in the morning, a fleet of black sedans pulled up to the gated entrance of their mansion. 2 federal marshals and a senior asset liquidator walked up the grand marble steps and handed Gregory a thick stack of legal documents. It was a notice of immediate non-negotiable foreclosure. Gregory, wearing his silk morning robe, initially tried to use his arrogant, booming voice to intimidate the officers. He demanded to speak to the bank manager, claiming there had to be a clerical error. He grabbed his phone and frantically dialed his high-priced lawyers, only to find that none of them would take his calls because their retainer checks had just bounced. The liquidator calmly informed him that his primary lender had sold their entire portfolio of debt just 48 hours prior. The new owner of their mortgage, their business loans, and their massive credit lines was an aggressive offshore investment firm. My investment firm. The clauses I had my legal team activate required immediate repayment in full due to a breach of contract triggered by Brent's felony arrest. Gregory and Evelyn did not have the cash. Their bank accounts were already drained from the bail bondsman. The marshals informed them they had exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises before the locks were changed and their luxury vehicles were seized. Evelyn screamed as she saw her wealthy neighbors peering through their hedges, watching the spectacle unfold. The pristine white world they had used to insult me at dinner was systematically dismantled before their very eyes. They were completely ruined. Panic strips away false pride faster than anything else in the world. With their credit cards declining and the realization that their son was unemployable and facing federal prison, Gregory and Evelyn had nowhere left to turn. They knew exactly who held the reins of their destruction. That afternoon, the same luxury sedan that usually conveyed them to exclusive golf courses sped into the gravel parking lot of my modest auto repair shop. I was standing near the main service bay, dressed once again in my comfortable faded work clothes, wiping down a heavy steel wrench. I watched as Gregory and Evelyn stepped out of their car. The transformation was pathetic. The arrogant posture, the condescending smiles, and the designer elegance had completely evaporated. They looked like terrified, desperate animals. They walked into my garage, completely ignoring the thick oil stains on the floor they had previously sneered at. Gregory stopped a few feet away from me, his hands trembling violently. He opened his mouth, trying to find the commanding tone he had used at the dinner table, but nothing came out except a weak, pathetic stammer. Evelyn did not even try to maintain her dignity. She lunged forward and physically dropped to her knees on the greasy, hard concrete. Her expensive designer dress soaked up the dark oil stains as she clasped her hands together, weeping hysterically. She begged me for mercy. She pleaded with me to reconsider the foreclosure, crying that they would be homeless, that their social circle would banish them, and that they were too old to start over. Gregory joined her, his knees hitting the floor with a heavy thud. He practically groveled, apologizing for every single racist and classist remark he had made. He swore that Brent was out of control and that they had no idea the boy was planning to rob me. In a stunning display of cowardice, Gregory even offered to testify against his own son in court if I would just give them their house back. They begged me to save their mansion, crying that we were family and that family should forgive each other's transgressions. I stood towering over them, holding my shop rag, looking down at the 2 people who had tried to pay me $100,000 to vanish from my own daughter's life. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I let them cry on the dirty floor for a long, agonizing moment, making sure they felt the absolute weight of their humiliation. Finally, I tossed the greasy rag onto a nearby workbench. I leaned down slightly, looking directly into Gregory's tear-filled eyes, and spoke with a voice as cold as absolute zero. I reminded them of the exact words they had so confidently delivered to me over their expensive roasted duck. I told them that I admired people willing to do menial labor to survive because they were going to have to learn how to do it very soon. I refused to stop the foreclosure. I looked at Evelyn and handed her own vicious demand right back to her. Take your son, pack whatever you can carry, and disappear so you do not stain my property. Naomi had arrived just moments behind them, stepping into the garage just in time to witness her arrogant in-laws sobbing on the grease-stained floor. She stood frozen in shock, her eyes darting from my cold expression to the ruined Gallagher family. I did not offer her a warm welcome. Instead, I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope provided by my private investigator. I walked over and placed it firmly into her trembling hands. I told her that since she loved her husband enough to steal from her own father, she deserved to see exactly what she was financing. Naomi tore the envelope open. A stack of high-definition photographs spilled into her hands. They clearly showed Brent wrapped around a beautiful 22-year-old woman outside a luxury boutique hotel. The bank statements attached to the photos proved Brent had been funding this mistress for 2 entire years, using the exact same supplementary credit cards Naomi had drained from my accounts. The ultimate betrayal had just been laid bare in her hands. Naomi stood frozen as the glossy photographs slipped from her trembling fingers and scattered across the grease-stained concrete floor of my auto shop. The images of her husband intimately entangled with a girl barely out of college were impossible to deny. The accompanying bank statements clearly highlighted charges at luxury boutique hotels, weekend getaways, and expensive jewelry stores, all funded by the exact same supplementary credit cards I had been secretly paying off for years. The absolute magnitude of the betrayal radiated through the garage. Evelyn and Gregory, still kneeling on the dirty floor, picked up the scattered photos. The sheer audacity of their son's reckless infidelity was the final spark needed to ignite the powder keg. At that exact moment, as if fate had orchestrated the perfect collision, a cheap yellow taxi pulled up to the curb outside my shop. Brent stumbled out looking completely disheveled, frantic, and stripped of his usual arrogance. Having just been fired and escorted out of the corporate headquarters by armed security, he had nowhere else to turn. He had come looking for his parents, desperate to formulate a new plan or beg for a massive cash injection to save his own skin. Instead, he walked right into an active execution. He stepped into the garage and froze, taking in the sight of his wealthy parents kneeling in the dark oil stains and his wife clutching hard evidence of his 2-year-long affair. The smug corporate executive was gone, replaced by a cornered rat who suddenly realized every single exit was completely blocked. The silence in the garage was deafening, a thick, suffocating tension that preceded a massive detonation. Naomi did not cry. The shock morphed instantly into a blinding, venomous rage. She marched toward the door, crushing the photographs under her expensive heels. The Gallagher family, once a unified front of high society snobbery, was about to consume itself alive right on my driveway. The explosion was immediate and violently physical. As Brent took a hesitant step forward, trying to stammer out a pathetic excuse about the photographs, Naomi swung her arm with every ounce of fury in her body. The slap echoed through the garage like a gunshot. Brent stumbled backward, his hand flying to his bright red cheek, his eyes wide with shock. Before he could even process the physical blow, his own parents launched their attack. Gregory scrambled up from the dirty concrete, his face twisted in absolute hatred. He pointed a shaking finger at his son and screamed that Brent had single-handedly destroyed their entire legacy. Gregory cursed him for losing their country club mansion, for destroying their pristine social standing, and for dragging their proud family name through the mud over a cheap affair and pathetic gambling debts. Evelyn joined in, shrieking that they were completely bankrupt because they had mortgaged their home to bail out a lying, cheating criminal. They verbally tore their son to shreds, completely abandoning any sense of parental loyalty in the face of their own financial ruin. They blamed him for my ruthless retaliation, refusing to take any responsibility for their own racist insults at the dinner table. Brent, pushed beyond his breaking point, finally snapped. The pressure of his massive debts, his humiliating arrest, his termination from the conglomerate, and the physical sting of his wife's slap broke whatever tiny shred of sanity he had left. He did not apologize. He did not beg for forgiveness. Instead, he unleashed a vile, venomous tirade that exposed the darkest, most disgusting corners of his soul. He looked Naomi dead in the eye and screamed that he had never loved her for a single second. He aggressively mocked her intelligence, declaring that she was nothing more than a gullible, annoying pawn he used to access my wealth. He yelled that he only tolerated her presence because he believed she was sitting on a massive trust fund. Then, in a moment of pure unhinged malice, Brent blamed Naomi for his current predicament. He screamed that if she had not been so slow, so cowardly, and so utterly incompetent at stealing my assets, he could have paid off his bookies months ago and avoided this entire nightmare. He shouted that she was just as worthless as the old mechanic she called a father, completely useless when it came to securing real power. The brutal honesty of his confession shattered any remaining illusion. They stood on the sidewalk outside my shop, screaming and tearing each other apart like a pack of starving cannibals, completely destroying their own lives, while I simply stood back and watched the carnage. The visceral screaming match ended with Brent storming off down the street on foot, completely abandoned by his bankrupt parents and his shattered wife. Gregory and Evelyn dragged themselves back to their luxury car and drove away in absolute disgrace, knowing they had exactly 24 hours before federal marshals locked them out of their mansion forever. Naomi was left standing alone in the gravel parking lot, her perfect high society fantasy reduced to toxic ash. Within 48 hours, she officially filed for a highly contested divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and extreme infidelity. But Naomi had learned absolutely nothing about accountability or honest work. Instead of reflecting on her own deceit, she immediately reverted to her lifelong habit of seeking a financial savior. The very next afternoon, she crawled back to my home. She knocked on my front door, reverting to her childhood tactics, turning on the tears and adopting the posture of a severely wounded victim. She sat in my living room, sobbing uncontrollably, completely glossing over the fact that she had recently broken into my safe to steal my property. She begged me to unlock her frozen trust fund immediately. She audaciously claimed she desperately needed the capital to hire a luxury divorce attorney and demanded a massive withdrawal as compensation for the severe emotional distress Brent had caused her. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, fully expecting her billionaire father to open his wallet and reward her treacherous behavior with a multi-million-dollar payout. I sat perfectly still in my armchair, watching Naomi bury her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent theatrical sobs. She cried loudly, demanding emotional distress compensation and access to a trust fund she believed held millions. I looked at the tears streaming down her face, but I did not feel a single ounce of paternal sympathy. I saw right through her carefully constructed performance. She was not crying because she felt guilty for breaking into my home office in the middle of the night to steal from me. She was not shedding tears because she regretted standing by while her husband publicly humiliated me at her wedding in front of hundreds of people. She was crying because her golden ticket had expired and she had just discovered that the father she treated like a peasant was actually a billionaire. Her grief was entirely manufactured, a desperate manipulation tactic she had perfected over the years. She had calculated the exact amount of tears required to manipulate a wealthy old man into opening his vault. She assumed that underneath my cold exterior I was still the same soft, accommodating mechanic who would hand over my life savings just to see her smile. She wanted luxury. She wanted top-tier divorce attorneys to exact her revenge on Brent, and she wanted a massive cash payout to cushion her bruised ego. She looked up at me through wet eyelashes, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand, waiting for me to pull out my checkbook and validate her victimhood. Instead of reaching for my wallet, I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and delivered a reality check she was completely unprepared to hear. I told Naomi in a voice as calm and unyielding as a steel vault that she would not receive a single cent of emotional distress compensation from my accounts. I explained that my wealth was built on decades of grueling, honest labor, not on rewarding treachery and profound entitlement. Her fake tears instantly stopped, replaced by a look of sheer panicked bewilderment. She tried to argue, raising her voice, claiming she was legally entitled to the trust fund I had created for her. I quickly corrected her delusion. I informed her that the trust was entirely revocable, and I had already instructed my wealth management team to liquidate it and transfer the assets into a philanthropic scholarship fund. I watched the color drain from her face as the reality of her total financial isolation set in. She gasped, realizing she was entirely cut off from the lifestyle she thought she deserved. However, I was not going to leave her completely defenseless against the legal nightmare Brent had dragged her into. I offered her a single, non-negotiable lifeline. I told her I would cover the legal fees required to process her divorce and untangle her from Brent's disastrous financial liabilities. But my assistance came with an absolute ironclad condition. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a thick legal document, sliding it across the coffee table toward her. It was a binding, irrevocable waiver of inheritance drafted flawlessly by my lead corporate attorney, Michael Rosenthal. I looked her dead in the eye and laid out the exact terms. If she wanted my help getting out of her marriage, she had to sign the document immediately. By signing, she would legally forfeit any and all future claims to my billionaire estate, my properties, my corporate holdings, and my personal assets. She would walk away with absolutely nothing but her freedom from Brent. I told her she had to make a choice right then and there. She could either walk out of my house empty-handed and face Brent's furious underground creditors completely alone, or she could sign her inheritance away forever and secure the legal representation she desperately needed to survive the upcoming storm. She stared at me, searching for any sign of hesitation, but she found absolutely none. Naomi stared at the dense legal document resting on the coffee table as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. She knew she was completely cornered with no remaining avenues for escape. Over the past 48 hours, Brent's violent underground bookies had started calling her personal cell phone, aggressively threatening her with severe physical harm if the massive gambling debts were not paid in full by the end of the week. Her bank accounts were overdrawn, her credit score was entirely destroyed, and she did not have a single dollar to her name to hire even a mediocre defense attorney. The crushing weight of her bleak reality finally broke her arrogant spirit. With a shaking hand, she picked up the silver pen and signed her name on the dotted line, officially and legally cutting herself off from my billion-dollar empire forever. I took the signed contract, secured it in my desk, and told her I would fulfill my end of the bargain. Naomi let out a massive sigh of relief, clearly expecting me to deploy Michael Rosenthal and his elite army of ruthless corporate sharks to obliterate Brent in family court. She assumed she would be represented by the most expensive, brilliant legal minds money could buy. But I never promised her luxury. I only promised to pay her legal fees. The very next morning, Naomi arrived at the address I provided for her new legal counsel. She did not walk into a towering glass skyscraper or a sleek corporate boardroom with panoramic views of the city. Instead, she found herself standing in a cramped, poorly lit office, located in a rundown strip mall on the bad side of town. I had hired the absolute cheapest, most notoriously overworked public defender-style attorney in the entire county. The lawyer was drowning in hundreds of low-level cases, his tiny desk covered in sticky coffee stains and messy stacks of disorganized paperwork. Naomi called me in a complete panic, furious and humiliated, screaming to know why I had assigned her a discount lawyer instead of my elite corporate team. I answered the phone and calmly reminded her that she was no longer an heiress entitled to billion-dollar privileges. She was an ordinary broke citizen dealing with the heavy consequences of her own terrible choices, and from now on she would have to fight her own battles from the absolute bottom. The consequences of stealing from a billionaire are never localized to a simple municipal police precinct. When Naomi cracked my safe and handed that physical deed to Brent, she did not just steal a piece of paper. Because my auto shop was legally registered as a primary operational asset under an international logistics conglomerate, any attempt to fraudulently leverage that property immediately crossed the threshold into federal jurisdiction. Within 48 hours of Brent's arrest, the local district attorney realized the sheer magnitude of the financial crimes involved and handed the entire case file over to the United States Department of Justice. Federal prosecutors thrive on crushing arrogant white-collar criminals, and Brent had just handed them a slam-dunk case wrapped in a neat little bow. My lead attorney, Michael Rosenthal, ensured the transition was absolutely seamless. Michael personally delivered the encrypted hard drives containing the high-definition security footage of the break in the audio recordings of Brent's extortion attempts and the detailed digital audit trails of the forged loan documents. The feds took one look at the evidence and immediately escalated the charges from simple burglary to major federal wire fraud, attempted corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. Brent had tried to secure a massive commercial loan across state lines using stolen corporate assets. The FBI formally took over the investigation, transforming Brent's localized nightmare into a sprawling federal crusade that carried mandatory minimum prison sentences. The legal noose was no longer just tightening. It was preparing to snap his neck with ruthless federal efficiency. I sat in my plush leather chair in the corporate boardroom, sipping my black coffee, receiving live updates from Michael. I watched the wheels of absolute justice begin to grind the man who called me a loser into fine dust. The federal agents did not stop with Brent. They were meticulous, ruthless, and highly motivated to uncover every single co-conspirator involved in the massive corporate fraud attempt. They methodically processed the evidence, dusting the stolen physical deed and the heavy steel door of my home office safe for prints. The forensic results were undeniable and absolutely devastating for my daughter. 2 days after Brent was transferred to federal holding, 2 stern-looking FBI agents in sharp, dark suits showed up at the cramped, dingy apartment Naomi had been forced to rent with the last of her available cash. They did not ask politely. They flashed their badges, ordered her to step out of the doorway, and escorted her directly into the back of an unmarked federal vehicle. She was brought into a freezing, windowless interrogation room at the downtown federal building. Naomi sat shivering at the metal table, clutching the cheap polyester coat she had bought from a thrift store, completely terrified. The pristine, wealthy world she thought she belonged to had vanished, replaced by cold steel and harsh fluorescent lighting. Her overworked discount public defender arrived 20 minutes late, sweating and clutching a disorganized legal pad, offering her absolutely no reassurance. The lead federal agent dropped a thick manila folder onto the metal table with a loud, echoing thud. He slid an evidence bag across the surface. Inside was the original physical deed to my auto shop. The agent looked Naomi dead in the eye and coldly informed her that her fingerprints were plastered all over the document, the dial of the safe, and the handle of the office door. He explicitly stated that they had matched the timestamps on the forensic evidence directly with the security footage of her sneaking through my hallway in the dead of night. Naomi tried to stammer out a defense, claiming she was just retrieving personal family documents. The agent immediately cut her off, showing her the forged bank loan application where Brent had attempted to use that exact same deed to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars. The agent leaned forward and bluntly told her she was no longer being treated as a naive bystander. She was now the primary suspect in a federal conspiracy to defraud a major financial institution. Her discount lawyer simply stared at the floor, completely outmatched and unable to offer a single legal objection to save her. While Naomi was sweating under the harsh lights of the federal interrogation room, Brent was sitting in a maximum security holding cell, rapidly calculating his own grim survival. The federal prosecutors had formally presented him with the finalized charge sheet. He was staring down the barrel of 15 to 20 years in a federal penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of early parole. His arrogant facade finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The reality of losing his custom suits, his fancy dinners, and his freedom broke him instantly. Faced with the terrifying prospect of spending the next 2 decades behind bars, Brent did exactly what cowards do best. He bypassed his own legal counsel and demanded a meeting with the federal district attorney. He sat in the proffer room, trembling and crying, begging for a plea deal. To save his own skin, he eagerly threw his own wife directly under the speeding bus. He falsely claimed that Naomi was the criminal mastermind behind the entire operation. He told the ruthless federal prosecutors that she was the one who knew the combination to the safe, she was the one who planned the midnight theft, and she was the one who manipulated him into presenting the stolen deed to the bank. He painted himself as a naive husband misled by a greedy daughter. In a desperate bid for a reduced prison sentence, Brent officially signed an agreement to become the star witness for the federal government and testify under oath against Naomi in a court of law. The very next morning, a heavy knock echoed through Naomi's cheap apartment. She opened the door to find a federal process server standing on the worn welcome mat. He handed her a thick legal envelope and walked away without uttering a single word. Naomi tore open the seal with shaking hands, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs. It was a formal federal subpoena commanding her to appear in United States District Court to face multiple felony charges for grand larceny and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. But the absolute worst part was printed clearly on the second page under the prosecution's witness list. Right at the very top, printed in bold black ink, was the name Brent Gallagher. She dropped the heavy stack of papers onto the cheap linoleum floor, her knees buckling beneath her as she collapsed. The devastating reality hit her like a freight train. She was completely and utterly alone. She had arrogantly signed away her billion-dollar inheritance, actively alienated the only father who ever truly loved her, and was now facing decades in a federal prison. She had sacrificed everything for the illusion of high society, only to be completely betrayed and sold out by the exact same arrogant husband she had chosen over her own flesh and blood. The federal courthouse was an imposing fortress of polished mahogany and cold marble. a place where absolute truths were finally separated from comfortable lies. I sat in the front row of the gallery wearing a charcoal Tom Ford suit, watching the culmination of my silent adjustment unfold. Brent and Naomi sat at separate defense tables, physically divided by their mutual betrayals and the impending reality of federal prison. Naomi looked completely hollowed out, wearing a faded, inexpensive blouse flanked by her exhausted and disorganized public defender. Brent, having struck his cowardly plea deal to testify against his wife, sat with a smug, misplaced confidence next to a flashy court-appointed defense attorney who was desperately seeking a high-profile legal victory. When the trial commenced, Brent's lawyer immediately launched into a repulsive, highly calculated opening statement. He paced arrogantly before the jury box, employing every vile dog whistle racist trope he could legally muster in a federal courtroom. He painted a completely fabricated picture of an angry, vengeful, unhinged black man who harbored deep-seated resentment toward his successful white son-in-law. He spun a ridiculous narrative claiming I was an out-of-touch, bitter mechanic who maliciously laid complex financial traps to destroy a young, ambitious couple out of pure spite and racial jealousy. He argued that the entire situation was a massive entrapment scheme designed by a paranoid old man who simply could not handle the fact that his daughter had married into high society. The lawyer spoke with dramatic flair, pointing fingers and raising his voice, trying to convince the 12 jurors that Brent was actually the victim of my ruthless, orchestrated cruelty. I did not flinch. I did not glare, shake my head, or shift in my seat. I simply sat with my hands folded, radiating quiet authority, knowing with absolute certainty that his disgusting performance was about to hit an impenetrable brick wall. The federal prosecutors stepped up and called their first key witness to the stand. William Thorne walked into the courtroom with the commanding presence of a seasoned executive, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression deadly serious. Brent actually sat up straighter, foolishly believing that his former CEO was there to testify about Brent's supposedly stellar corporate sales record and perhaps validate the narrative of the crazy father-in-law. Instead, Thorne took the oath, sat down in the witness box, and systematically dismantled the defense's entire racist narrative piece by piece. Under the prosecutor's precise questioning, Thorne revealed my true identity to the open court. He did not describe a bitter, uneducated mechanic. He detailed my brilliant corporate mind, outlining how I had built a multi-billion-dollar international logistics conglomerate from the ground up, navigating a ruthless corporate world heavily designed to keep men like me locked out. Thorne spoke with absolute reverence, tearing down the defense attorney's character assassination with undeniable facts. He testified about my quiet, anonymous philanthropy, my flawless business ethics, and my impeccable personal character. He looked directly at the jury and stated that I was the most brilliant, disciplined, and generous man he had ever known in his 40-year career. Then Thorne turned his attention directly to Brent. Without raising his voice, Thorne legally and professionally executed Brent's reputation. He testified that Brent was a mediocre, entirely expendable, mid-level employee who possessed no real talent, only a loud mouth, a staggering sense of unearned entitlement, and a concerning habit of shifting blame to his subordinates. Thorne explicitly stated that Brent brought nothing but liability and shame to the conglomerate, which was why he had been terminated the very second his crimes were brought to light. I watched Brent's jaw physically drop. The smug confidence evaporated instantly from his face. His expensive defense attorney stopped taking notes, his face draining of color as he realized the angry, unhinged mechanic he had just slandered in his opening statement was actually one of the most powerful and respected billionaires on the Eastern Seaboard. Naomi stared blankly at the floor, the sheer crushing weight of what she had thrown away pressing down heavily on her shoulders. The defense attorney desperately tried to object, scrambling to stop the bleeding and regain control of his narrative, but the federal prosecutor was completely merciless. Armed with the digital arsenal my lawyer Michael Rosenthal had seamlessly handed over to the Department of Justice, the prosecutor moved to present the hard, undeniable evidence. The courtroom lights dimmed and large, high-definition monitors mounted across the room flickered to life. The first piece of evidence was the infrared security footage recovered from my home office. The jury watched in absolute pin-drop silence as Naomi crept through my hallway in the dead of night. The camera captured her face with flawless clarity as she cracked my old steel safe, completely bypassed her late mother's velvet jewelry boxes, and deliberately stole the physical deed to the auto shop. Her premeditated betrayal was broadcast in stunning high resolution, stripping away any possible claim of naive innocence or accidental involvement. Her discount public defender buried his face in his hands, completely unable to mount a defense against crystal-clear video evidence. But the prosecution was far from finished. The screens shifted from video to an audio playback graphic. The crisp, clean recording of the corrupt psychiatrist visit echoed off the heavy oak panels of the courtroom. Brent's voice rang out loud and clear, explicitly outlining his sinister plan to have me declared medically unfit. The jury heard him openly discussing the falsification of medical documents. They heard him attempting to bribe the disgraced doctor with cash to secure a fraudulent, fast-tracked diagnosis of severe senile dementia and paranoia. Furthermore, Naomi's voice could be heard on the tape actively agreeing with the sinister plot and suggesting ways to make my supposed mental decline look more convincing to a judge. Brent's own voice proved his absolute malice, his premeditation, and his complete lack of human decency. The plea deal he thought would save him suddenly looked utterly worthless when the entire courtroom heard him orchestrating the psychological destruction of an innocent man. The defense's case completely disintegrated into dust right before our eyes. The flashy defense attorney slowly sat down, closing his legal pad and snapping his pen shut fully, realizing he had just walked into a federal slaughterhouse with no way out. The federal judge, a stern woman with decades of unforgiving experience on the bench, looked down from her elevated position. Her expression was one of absolute, unadulterated disgust. She glared at Brent and Naomi, viewing them not just as federal criminals, but as repulsive human beings who had arrogantly conspired to ruin a father who had given them absolutely everything. The heavy wooden gavel fell with a loud, cracking finality that echoed through the cavernous federal courtroom. The judge leaned forward, her eyes locked onto Brent Gallagher, stripping away whatever microscopic shred of hope he still harbored. She did not mince her words. She declared his actions to be among the most repulsive displays of greed, entitlement, and manipulation she had ever witnessed in her entire career on the bench. She systematically listed his convictions aloud for the official record, ensuring every single person in the gallery heard the absolute depth of his criminality. Brent was officially found guilty of conspiracy to commit bank fraud, federal wire fraud, attempted corporate embezzlement, felony forgery, and aggravated extortion. The judge explicitly noted that his attempt to weaponize the medical system to falsely imprison a sane, innocent man was a profound violation of human decency. She handed down the maximum allowable sentence under his cowardly plea agreement. Brent was sentenced to 8 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The judge sternly reminded him that in the federal justice system, there is absolutely no parole for good behavior. He would serve every single day of those 8 years behind thick concrete walls and razor wire, completely stripped of his luxuries. The arrogant, slick corporate executive who had scoffed at my worn suit and calloused hands completely broke down. He collapsed into his heavy wooden chair, violently sobbing, his face buried in his trembling hands. The sharp-dressed defense attorney quickly stepped away from him, physically distancing himself from the toxic wreckage of his client. 2 heavy-set federal marshals immediately approached the defense table. They grabbed Brent by his custom-tailored shoulders, yanked him roughly to his feet, and secured his wrists tightly behind his back with heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic click resonated sharply in the quiet room. Brent desperately looked around the gallery, his tear-filled eyes searching for a sympathetic face, a powerful friend, or a last-minute savior. He found absolutely nothing. He looked at me, his face pale and contorted with sheer terror. I did not smile. I did not nod. I simply maintained a cold, impassive stare as I watched the marshals march him out through the heavy side doors, disappearing into the dark holding cells of the federal justice system. His leased luxury cars, his exclusive country club memberships, and his fake high society persona were completely erased, instantly replaced by a neon orange jumpsuit and an inmate identification number. The absolute devastation of the Gallagher family did not end with Brent's incarceration. The financial chokehold I had placed on his parents had completely suffocated their artificial empire. Without the ability to secure new lines of credit, and facing the immediate aggressive foreclosure of their sprawling estate, Gregory and Evelyn were officially forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Their assets were ruthlessly liquidated by the federal courts to satisfy their monumental debts. Their luxury imported vehicles were towed away on flatbed trucks right in front of their neighbors. Their designer furniture, crystal chandeliers, and expensive art collections were auctioned off to the highest bidder. The wealthy, pretentious friends they had spent decades trying to impress turned a blind eye, treating the Gallagher family like a contagious disease. Stripped of every single dime, Gregory and Evelyn were forcefully evicted from their gated community. With zero savings and completely destroyed credit scores, they had absolutely no choice but to relocate to the exact type of neighborhood they used to openly mock. They were forced to rent a tiny, dilapidated one-bedroom apartment on the worst side of town. The building had peeling paint, faulty plumbing, and the constant smell of garbage in the narrow hallways. Gregory, a man who used to confidently bark orders at waiters and country club staff, was now forced to take a minimum wage job as a night shift security guard just to keep the lights on. Evelyn, who had once sneered at my blue-collar background, was reduced to clipping coupons and shopping at discount thrift stores to survive. Their arrogant racist pride had been thoroughly crushed by the brutal, unforgiving reality of extreme poverty. Naomi sat frozen at her defense table watching the total annihilation of the family she had sold her soul to join. Because Brent had cowardly flipped on her to secure his own plea deal, she was left completely exposed to the wrath of the federal prosecutors. She had no leverage, no expensive lawyers, and absolutely no defense against the crystal-clear video evidence of her cracking my safe in the dead of night. However, the judge recognized that Naomi had been heavily manipulated and ultimately betrayed by her predatory husband. Factoring in her lack of prior criminal history and her forced cooperation with the remaining investigation, the judge offered a stern but slightly more lenient judgment. Naomi was spared federal prison time, but her punishment was severely designed to break her massive entitlement. She was sentenced to 3 years of strict federal probation, which included random drug testing and severe travel restrictions. Furthermore, the judge mandated 1,000 hours of grueling manual community service. She would be cleaning highways, scrubbing graffiti off city walls, and picking up trash in the sweltering heat, forced to perform the exact kind of manual labor she had always viewed as completely beneath her. The gavel slammed down one final time, officially closing the trial. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving Naomi sitting completely alone. Her incredibly cheap public defender packed his disorganized briefcase and walked away without uttering a single word of comfort. When Naomi finally gathered the strength to stand and walk out of the heavy double doors of the courthouse, the blinding afternoon sun hit her face. She stood on the wide concrete steps, looking out at the bustling city traffic, possessing absolutely nothing. Her divorce from Brent was finalized, leaving her completely unattached to the man who had ruined her. She had willingly signed away her rights to my billion-dollar estate. She was entirely penniless, carrying a severe federal felony record that would make securing a decent corporate job nearly impossible. She did not have a husband to rely on, she did not have a wealthy in-law family to fall back on, and she had completely alienated the only father who had ever genuinely loved her. As my black armored SUV pulled away from the curb, I watched her through the tinted glass. She walked slowly down the courthouse steps toward the nearest public bus stop, a broken, isolated woman facing the harsh, unforgiving consequences of her own devastating betrayal. I watched the city bus carry my daughter away, pulling the heavy curtain closed on the most painful chapter of my life. My armored vehicle smoothly navigated away from the federal courthouse, but I did not direct my driver to head toward my corporate tower. Instead, I ordered him to take me to the old auto shop one final time. The grease-stained garage had served its ultimate purpose. For decades, it had been my sanctuary and my anchor to reality. It was the quiet disguise that kept me grounded, the shield that hid my immense wealth, and ultimately the perfect test that exposed the absolute greed of the people I had trusted most. I walked through the heavy, rolling metal doors, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of motor oil and metallic dust. Tariq, my lead mechanic, was wiping down a heavy transmission block. Tariq was a hard-working, honest young black man who had stood faithfully by my side for 15 grueling years. He never asked for a handout, never complained about the long hours, and treated every single customer with absolute respect. I called Tariq into my cramped back office. He wiped his hands on a rag, looking genuinely concerned by my serious expression. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, official legal binder. I slid it across the battered wooden desk. Tariq looked at the documents, his eyes widening in complete shock. It was not a promotion or a bonus check. It was the original ironclad physical deed to the entire auto shop, completely paid off and legally transferred entirely into his name. I told him I was officially retiring from the garage and that the business, the expensive diagnostic equipment, and the valuable commercial land now belonged exclusively to him. He stammered, tears welling in his eyes, insisting he could never afford to buy me out. I stopped him immediately. I stated clearly that true loyalty and honest labor are currencies far more valuable than cash, and he had earned every single brick of this building. I stood up, unbuttoned my faded, oil-stained flannel shirt, and draped it over the back of my old desk chair. I shook his hand firmly, walked out of the garage, and stepped into the bright afternoon sun. My blue-collar disguise was permanently retired. The very next morning, I stepped completely out of the shadows. I walked through the towering glass doors of my logistics conglomerate headquarters, deliberately bypassing the secret private elevators I had used for years. I strode directly through the main executive lobby wearing a meticulously tailored dark charcoal suit. Whispers rippled through the massive building as the employees finally connected a face to the anonymous billionaire chairman who owned their entire network. I convened an emergency session with my executive board led by my fiercely loyal corporate attorney, Michael Rosenthal. I did not call them together to discuss quarterly profits, supply chain expansions, or standard corporate acquisitions. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table and announced the immediate liquidation of several high-yield offshore accounts. I was reallocating a massive portion of my personal wealth to establish a colossal, heavily funded nonprofit organization. I named it the Diane Jenkins Trade and Logistics Endowment, honoring the memory of my late wife, a woman who always believed that true power was found in lifting others up rather than tearing them down. The foundation was explicitly designed with a ruthless, targeted efficiency to support marginalized African American youth from the inner city. I wanted to find the kids who had the relentless drive, the sharp intelligence, and the raw ambition, but who were entirely locked out of the system by systemic poverty and classist barriers. The endowment would fully cover tuition for specialized trade schools, advanced mechanic certifications, and top-tier logistics degrees. Furthermore, it established a massive pool of zero-interest business grants for graduates who wanted to start their own commercial enterprises, completely shielding them from the predatory banking systems that trap so many young entrepreneurs. Later that week, I stood at a podium in front of a packed room of regional journalists and national business reporters to officially announce the fund. The media was absolutely stunned by the sudden dramatic emergence of a stealth billionaire who had built a dominant logistics empire in complete silence. Flashing cameras illuminated the room as I delivered a speech that left no room for misinterpretation. I spoke directly about the absolute dignity of manual labor. I stated firmly that real wealth is never measured by the brand of suit you wear, the luxury car you drive, or the exclusionary country club you belong to. True wealth is measured entirely by the strong foundation you build for the next generation and the genuine respect you show to the people working in the dirt. It was a soaring, public testament to everything the Gallagher family had blindly despised, broadcasting my absolute triumph over their hollow, arrogant society. Several weeks after the highly publicized press conference, the autumn weather brought a sharp, biting chill to the air. I was sitting comfortably in the grand study of my sprawling, quiet suburban estate. A crackling fire burned brightly in the massive stone fireplace, casting a warm golden glow across the dark wood paneling of the room. I was peacefully sipping a cup of hot black tea while reviewing the very first batch of scholarship applications for Diane's endowment, feeling a profound sense of purpose I had not felt in years. My private security director knocked gently on the heavy oak door, stepping into the room to hand me the daily mail delivery. Nestled among the sleek corporate envelopes and glossy financial reports was a highly distinct, cheaply made piece of paper. It was a standard issue, coarse envelope, heavily stamped with the official seal of the United States Federal Penitentiary System. The return address, printed in the top left corner, bore a cold, impersonal inmate identification number. Right below those digits was the name Brent Gallagher. Through my extensive legal network, I already knew exactly what the letter contained. Brent was experiencing the absolute crushing horror of maximum security federal prison, stripped of his arrogant swagger, his tailored suits, and his wealthy parents' safety net. His abrasive, condescending personality had immediately made him a prime target among the hardened, unforgiving inmate population. He had absolutely no outside funds, zero physical protection, and no leverage to negotiate his survival. The letter was a pathetic, groveling plea begging the exact same man he had publicly humiliated to deposit emergency survival money into his prison commissary account. I looked down at the miserable, wrinkled piece of mail resting in my hands. I did not feel a single drop of pity or compassion. I did not open the envelope. I completely refused to waste my valuable time reading his desperate excuses, his cowardly apologies, or his pathetic cries for financial mercy. I held the cheap coarse paper between my fingers, walked directly over to the roaring stone fireplace, and simply opened my hand. I tossed the unopened letter straight into the center of the blazing inferno. I stood in absolute silence, watching the bright orange flames instantly consume the paper, turning Brent Gallagher's final desperate plea into a handful of worthless black ash. The heavy glass doors of the federal courthouse were miles behind her, but the crushing weight of her criminal sentence followed Naomi everywhere she went. It was a bleak, freezing Tuesday evening on the absolute worst side of the city. The flashing neon sign outside the diner buzzed with a loud, faulty electrical hum, casting a harsh red glow across the cracked linoleum floor inside. This was not a trendy, upscale brunch spot where the corporate elite gathered to sip expensive mimosas and complain about their luxury vehicles. This was a greasy spoon diner, a relentless, punishing establishment that catered to exhausted truck drivers, third-shift factory workers, and people who had absolutely no safety net left in the world. Naomi was currently working a brutal 14-hour double shift. She wore a cheap, ill-fitting polyester uniform that permanently smelled of burnt frying oil and stale bleach. Her pristine, expensive manicures were a distant memory. Her hands were currently raw, red and covered in tiny burns from the industrial dishwashing sink. Her feet, once accustomed to designer heels, were swollen and blistered inside cheap, non-slip rubber shoes. She was carrying a heavy plastic bin loaded with dirty, half-eaten plates, mechanically wiping down sticky tables with a gray, heavily sanitized rag. The federal judge had not shown her a single ounce of mercy when outlining her financial restitution. She was legally required to pay exorbitant monthly court fees, probation monitoring costs, and mandatory victim restitution funds. If she missed a single payment, her strict probation would be instantly revoked and she would be sent directly to a federal holding facility. She was no longer a spoiled heiress living in a luxury bubble. She was a convicted felon trapped in the grueling, unforgiving reality of minimum wage survival. Every single dollar she earned was immediately swallowed by her monumental legal debts, leaving her with barely enough to buy cheap groceries and pay rent for her dangerous tiny apartment. I parked my black armored SUV across the street, watching her through the tinted glass. I watched my daughter, the woman who once looked at hard labor with absolute undisguised disgust, scrubbing a filthy table until her knuckles turned white. I stepped out of my vehicle, adjusted the collar of my tailored charcoal suit, and walked directly across the rain-slicked street. When I pushed open the heavy glass door of the diner, a small brass bell chimed loudly, cutting through the low murmur of tired conversations and the clattering of cheap silverware. Naomi was standing near the wait station, desperately trying to balance a stack of heavy ceramic coffee mugs. At the exact sound of the bell, she turned her head. Her exhausted, dark-rimmed eyes met mine across the dingy room. She froze completely. The heavy ceramic mugs rattled dangerously in her grip, threatening to crash onto the floor. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking paler than the harsh fluorescent lights above. I did not glare at her, nor did I offer a comforting fatherly smile. I maintained an expression of absolute, unyielding calm. I walked deliberately past the front counter, bypassed the empty booths near the entrance, and slid into a cracked, faded red vinyl booth stationed directly in her assigned section. The strict protocol of her job dictated her next move, but the profound, crushing shame paralyzed her. She stood rooted to the spot for a long, agonizing minute. She knew she could not run away. She knew she could not demand a manager switch her section. She had to face the billionaire father she had betrayed, robbed, and publicly humiliated while wearing a grease-stained apron. She slowly set the mugs down on the counter, picked up a glass pot of steaming black coffee, and began the long, humiliating walk toward my table. Every step she took seemed to require a monumental physical effort. When she finally reached my booth, she did not look me in the eye. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the chipped formica table. Her hands, rough and calloused from weeks of relentless manual labor, were trembling violently. She reached for the thick ceramic mug sitting in front of me and tipped the glass pot. The dark liquid poured out in a shaky, uneven stream. She was fighting a massive internal battle just to keep the hot coffee from splashing over the edges and burning my hands. I watched her intensely, searching for the old Naomi. I waited for her to burst into manipulative, theatrical tears. I fully expected her to slam the pot down, throw away her pride, and beg me for a massive financial rescue. I anticipated the desperate pleas for a luxury apartment, a new car, or a high-paying corporate job within my logistics empire. I waited for her to complain that the work was too hard, the customers were too rude, and the pay was utterly insulting. but the pleas never came. She did not ask for a single dime. The immense crushing weight of the federal justice system and the brutal reality of the working class had completely beaten the staggering entitlement out of her. She finished pouring the coffee, stepped back, and stood in absolute silence, waiting for my order like a professional broken employee serving a wealthy stranger. She swallowed hard, her throat visibly tightening, but she held her tongue, fully accepting the monumental consequences of the choices she had made. I did not ask for a menu, I did not order a meal. I simply picked up the heavy ceramic mug, took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter, burnt coffee, and set it back down on the table. The silence between us was heavier than the humid, grease-filled air of the diner. It was a silence built on the ruins of a destroyed family, but also a silence that marked the very first foundational brick of a brutal reality check. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. I extracted a single crisp $20 bill. I did not toss it carelessly. I placed it completely flat on the center of the sticky table, pressing my index finger firmly against the face of the bill. Naomi finally raised her head, her exhausted, bloodshot eyes meeting my unwavering gaze. She looked at the money, then looked up at my face, bracing herself for a cruel, vindictive insult. She expected me to remind her of the wedding, to throw her failures in her face, or to mock her current wretched state. Instead, I spoke with a quiet, powerful authority that carried the absolute weight of a lifelong lesson. "This is honest money," I said, my voice steady and commanding. "Learn to respect it." I stood up, slid out of the cracked vinyl booth, and walked out of the diner without looking back. Naomi did not chase after me into the parking lot. She did not scream, complain, or curse her harsh circumstances. For the first time in her entire adult life, the crippling arrogance was completely gone. She stood alone in the dim light of the greasy spoon, staring down at the $20 bill resting on the table. She reached out, picked up the money with her callous, trembling fingers, and held it tightly against her chest. She lowered her head in a moment of pure, genuine humility, her shoulders dropping as the profound reality of the lesson finally pierced her soul. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty booth. I parked my SUV in the circular driveway of my sprawling, heavily wooded estate on the outskirts of the city. The stark contrast between the harsh, neon-lit diner where I had just left Naomi and the peaceful, lush sanctuary of my home could not have been more pronounced. It was a late Saturday afternoon in early autumn, and the air was crisp, carrying the rich, mouth-watering scent of hickory wood and slow-roasted brisket. I was hosting a small, intimate barbecue in my expansive backyard. There were no towering ice sculptures, no waiters in stiff white gloves, and absolutely no pretentious high society socialites trying to impress each other with fake, empty smiles. This gathering was reserved exclusively for the people who had proven their loyalty, the men who respected me long before they knew the true depth of my bank accounts. Michael Rosenthal, my lead corporate attorney, had happily traded his custom-tailored sharkskin suits for a faded denim jacket and comfortable jeans. He was currently standing near the massive stone fire pit, holding a paper plate loaded with ribs, laughing loudly at a joke being told by William Thorne. Thorne, the powerful CEO of my logistics conglomerate, looked completely relaxed, sipping a cold beer from a glass bottle. It was a stark, refreshing departure from the rigid corporate boardroom where he had mercilessly fired Brent Gallagher. Sitting at the long wooden picnic table was Tariq, my former lead mechanic, and the new proud owner of my old auto shop. He was surrounded by his smiling wife and two young children, happily telling stories about the massive surge in new customers at the garage. The atmosphere was completely authentic. The conversations were grounded in mutual respect, shared struggles, and genuine friendship. There was absolutely no posturing and no invisible hierarchies to navigate. I watched Tariq's youngest son run across the manicured lawn, chasing a firefly, his pure, innocent joy ringing out through the crisp autumn air. It was a beautiful reminder of what a family should actually look like. There were no hidden resentments, no calculated moves to secure a better inheritance, and no one measuring another person's worth by the brand of shoes they wore. We were just men who had survived the grueling grind of the real world, gathered together to celebrate survival, honesty, and hard work. I stood by the massive iron grill, using a pair of long steel tongs to turn the sizzling cuts of meat, feeling a profound sense of tranquility wash over my spirit. There was no anxiety about hidden agendas, no fear of financial manipulation, and no need to hide my true identity behind a grease-stained flannel shirt. The people in this backyard did not care about the size of my investment portfolios or the boundaries of my corporate empire. They valued my character, my word, and the undeniable bond we had forged through years of honest, straightforward collaboration. I watched them laugh and share food, realizing that this simple, unpretentious gathering was infinitely more valuable than any extravagant country club dinner the Gallagher family could ever afford to host. I felt a deep, resonant joy knowing I had surrounded myself with individuals who understood the true meaning of loyalty. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the evening sky in deep strokes of purple and bruised orange, I handed the grilling tongs to Tariq and stepped away from the lively noise of the backyard. I walked slowly up the wooden steps of my wrap-around porch, retreating to a quiet, shadowed corner overlooking the dense, silent tree line. I leaned heavily against the smooth wooden railing, letting the cool night air brush against my face. I looked up at the vast, glittering expanse of stars emerging in the darkening sky, taking a deep, slow breath that filled my lungs with the scent of pine and wood smoke. In the absolute quiet of the porch, I spoke softly into the night, directing my words to the only woman who had ever truly known my heart. I spoke to my late wife, Diane. I told her about the barbecue, about Tariq successfully taking over the shop, and about the peace I had finally managed to secure for our estate. But I also spoke about the crushing, undeniable ache in my chest that simply would not fade. I confessed to Diane how deeply it hurt to watch the daughter we had raised together scrubbing tables in a filthy diner, stripped of her pride and facing the brutal reality of the world completely alone. I admitted that a small, persistent part of my fatherly instinct still desperately wanted to rush in, pay off her federal fines, and buy her a comfortable, sheltered life. But I knew with absolute, unwavering certainty that rescuing her would have been a catastrophic mistake. I whispered into the cool breeze, explaining the harsh truth I had been forced to accept. Naomi had become infected by a toxic, malignant greed. The arrogance, the classism, and the blinding materialism she absorbed from Brent and his repulsive family had spread through her soul like a dangerous, fast-moving cancer. If I had simply treated the symptoms, if I had paid her debts and restored her trust fund without forcing her to face the consequences, the disease would have eventually consumed her entirely. It would have destroyed her humanity, her work ethic, and her basic capacity for empathy. The drastic, severe financial amputation I performed was agonizing, but it was absolutely vital. I had to cleanly cut out the rot to save the whole body. I told Diane that by forcing Naomi to earn her own living, to feel the physical ache of exhaustion, and to recognize the genuine value of a simple $20 bill, I had given our daughter the only real chance she had at saving her own life. The pain of our separation was the heavy necessary price I had to pay to ensure she would finally learn how to stand on her own 2 feet with genuine earned dignity. I knew Diane would have understood the terrible burden of this tough love, and knowing that gave me the strength to stand firm in my decision. The surgery was severe, but the patient was finally starting to breathe on her own. I stood there for a long time listening to the rich, echoing laughter of my true friends drifting up from the glowing backyard fire pit. A profound realization settled into my mind, bringing with it a deep, unbreakable peace that I had spent my entire life searching for. For years, I had believed that accumulating massive wealth was simply a protective tool to shield my family from hardship and guarantee their comfort. The Gallagher family conversely believed that wealth was a cruel weapon used to dominate, intimidate, and demand absolute submission from those they deemed socially inferior. But they were all entirely wrong. I finally understood the true, unadulterated definition of power. True power is not about possessing the ability to crush your enemies, to humiliate people in corporate boardrooms, or to make those around you tremble in fear of your financial retaliation. True power is the absolute, unyielding freedom to simply walk away from anyone who disrespects you. It is the ability to look at a room full of arrogant, toxic people, realize they add absolutely zero value to your soul, and calmly close the door on them forever without a single ounce of regret. I pushed off the wooden railing, turned my back on the darkening sky, and walked back down the stairs to join the laughter of the people who actually mattered. 2 years later, the heavy doors of the past remained firmly closed, but the future burned brilliantly bright. I stood on a brightly lit stage in the heart of the city, wearing a simple but sharp-tailored suit. The applause from the crowded auditorium washed over me as the mayor handed me a Lifetime Achievement Award for the Diane Jenkins Trade and Logistics Endowment. I looked out into the audience, seeing the faces of hundreds of young, driven men and women whose lives had been permanently changed by our scholarships. Surrounded by true friends and genuine respect, I smiled a deep, unbreakable smile. Miles away behind thick concrete walls and rusted razor wire, the brutal reality of consequence had completely settled. Brent Gallagher wore a stained, oversized orange jumpsuit. He knelt on the cold, wet floor of a maximum security cell block, his once manicured hands aggressively scrubbing the rim of a stainless steel prison toilet. His face was deeply haggard and visibly aged, his arrogant spirit utterly crushed by the unforgiving daily weight of his federal sentence. Across town, inside the harsh fluorescent glow of the Greasy Spoon Diner, Naomi stood perfectly still near the wait station. She looked up at the small, outdated television mounted in the corner of the room, watching the local news broadcast my acceptance speech. She wore a faded apron over her standard uniform, her hair tied back simply to keep it out of her face. A single tear escaped, rolling quietly down her cheek. She did not reach for her phone to call me, nor did she curse her harsh circumstances. She simply wiped the tear away with the back of her calloused hand, picked up her damp cleaning rag, and turned back to thoroughly wipe down a cracked vinyl booth. For the very first time in her entire life, she was earning her place in the world. The silent adjustment was absolutely complete. The ultimate lesson, the poison of unearned privilege and the crucible of true accountability. To truly comprehend the magnitude of the events that unfolded between Tyrone Naomi and the Gallagher family, we must look beyond the immediate satisfaction of a perfectly executed revenge. The surface of this narrative provides a thrilling tale of a hidden billionaire outsmarting a group of arrogant, debt-ridden socialites. However, beneath the satisfying collapse of Brent Gallagher and the harsh reality check delivered to Naomi, there lies a profound, deeply uncomfortable, and universally applicable philosophical lesson. This lesson is not merely about money, nor is it simply about the tactical mechanics of corporate sabotage. The ultimate lesson of this story revolves entirely around the destructive, deeply corrosive nature of unearned privilege and the absolute necessity of experiencing the crucible of true accountability. When we examine the foundation of Tyrone Jenkins and his immense empire, we see a man who was forged in the fires of genuine hardship. He built his multi-billion-dollar logistics conglomerate brick by brick, utilizing an extraordinary level of discipline, unmatched work ethic, and a profound understanding of human nature. He knew the precise value of a single dollar because he had bled, sweated, and sacrificed to earn it. However, the tragedy of Tyrone is a tragedy shared by countless successful parents across the globe. In his desperate, overwhelming desire to protect his only daughter from the grueling pain, the toxic fumes, and the exhausting labor he endured, he inadvertently constructed a flawless, comfortable prison for her soul. He weaponized his wealth to shield Naomi from the harsh realities of the world, completely failing to realize that by removing all of her struggles, he was simultaneously removing her only opportunity to develop genuine character, moral fortitude, and fundamental empathy. Tyrone provided Naomi with unlimited access to premium education, luxury housing, and high society comfort, completely insulating her from the foundational law of cause and effect. When a human being is never allowed to feel the sting of failure, the anxiety of an unpaid bill, or the physical exhaustion of manual labor, they inevitably lose their connection to basic humanity. Naomi did not become a cruel, arrogant woman overnight. Her transformation was a slow, insidious process fueled entirely by the limitless financial safety net her father secretly maintained. She began to view the world through a deeply distorted lens, a lens where respect was inherently tied to material possessions, designer labels, and exclusive country club memberships. Because she never had to earn her status, she believed she was inherently superior to those who had to work for theirs. This catastrophic delusion is the exact poison of unearned privilege. It convinces the beneficiary that their comfort is a fundamental human right, and it breeds a sickening contempt for the very people who sacrifice everything to provide that comfort. This toxic entitlement made Naomi the perfect target for a manipulative, predatory parasite like Brent Gallagher. Brent represented the absolute darkest manifestation of artificial status. He was a man entirely consumed by the desperate need to project an image of supreme wealth and untouchable power, despite being fundamentally hollow and drowning in violent underground debt. The Gallagher family operated on a philosophy of aggressive, performative superiority. They used their fragile, debt-financed wealth as a blunt weapon to intimidate, humiliate, and control anyone they deemed socially inferior. Brent recognized Naomi not as a partner, a confidant, or a beloved wife, but purely as a host organism. He identified her unearned privilege and her desperate desire to remain in the upper echelons of society as weaknesses he could ruthlessly exploit. Because Naomi had never developed the defensive instincts that are naturally forged through personal struggle, she was completely blind to his deceit. She mistook his arrogant swagger for genuine confidence, and she mistook his sociopathic manipulation for ambitious leadership. The story forces us to confront a terrifying reality about the commodification of human relationships. When wealth is introduced into a family dynamic without strict boundaries, without financial transparency, and without the absolute requirement of personal responsibility, love inevitably degenerates into a commercial transaction. Naomi did not value her father as a human being, as a grieving widower, or as the man who had loved her unconditionally. She viewed Tyrone strictly as a utility, an endless, reliable resource that existed solely to facilitate her desires. When Brent publicly humiliated Tyrone at the wedding reception, Naomi did not experience a moment of righteous, daughterly indignation. She experienced sheer embarrassment because her father did not fit into the pristine, wealthy aesthetic she was trying to project. Her allegiance was entirely dictated by her proximity to perceived power and social status. She was willing to discard her own flesh and blood to appease a husband who offered her the illusion of high society validation. This brings us to the agonizing, heartbreaking role of the parent who must become the surgeon. When Tyrone sat in his worn armchair and recognized the monstrous entitlement that had consumed his daughter, he faced the most agonizing decision of his entire life. He could have easily continued to play the role of the subservient, silent mechanic. He could have paid off Brent's monumental gambling debts, handed over the keys to a luxurious estate, and secured a comfortable, conflict-free existence for Naomi. He had billions of dollars at his disposal. A $300,000 debt was mathematically irrelevant to him. However, Tyrone possessed the profound wisdom to understand that utilizing his wealth to rescue Naomi would be an act of supreme cruelty disguised as love. If he bailed out Brent, he would be validating their treacherous behavior. He would be teaching his daughter that betrayal, theft, public humiliation, and classist cruelty carry absolutely no consequences as long as you have access to a massive bank account. He realized that saving her from the immediate financial crisis would permanently damn her soul to a life of hollow, parasitic existence. Therefore, Tyrone initiated the silent adjustment. He chose the path of excruciating tough love. He understood that the only known cure for the poison of unearned privilege is the unforgivable, brutal crucible of absolute accountability. By entirely freezing her trust fund, canceling her supplementary credit cards, and allowing the aggressive federal justice system to crash down upon her, Tyrone performed a necessary life-saving amputation. He completely stripped away the artificial financial armor that had been protecting her from reality. He forced Naomi to stand entirely naked before the terrifying consequences of her own disastrous choices. When Naomi was interrogated by ruthless federal agents, when she was betrayed and sold out by her cowardly husband, and when she was sentenced to grueling community service by a disgusted federal judge, she was finally experiencing the authentic, unfiltered consequences of life. The descent from a luxury country club to a grease-stained, neon-lit diner was not a punishment born out of vindictive anger. It was a carefully orchestrated resurrection. When Naomi was forced to don a cheap polyester uniform, scrub filthy tables, and endure the grueling exhaustion of a 14-hour double shift, she was finally participating in the real world. She was learning the foundational lessons of humanity that her father had accidentally shielded her from. Manual labor is a profound equalizer. It strips away arrogance, shatters delusions of superiority, and forces an individual to recognize the inherent dignity in every single working-class person they previously ignored. As Naomi wiped down those cracked vinyl booths and served hot coffee to exhausted truck drivers, the blinding narcissism she absorbed from the Gallagher family was systematically washed away. She was finally earning her breath. She was finally discovering the undeniable, bedrock truth that respect is never given. It is strictly earned through discipline, humility, and honest effort. The climactic moment of this entire narrative does not occur in the corporate boardroom, when Brent is fired, nor does it occur in the federal courthouse, when the gavel falls. The absolute climax of this story happens in the quiet, tense silence of the diner when Tyrone slides a single, crisp $20 bill across the sticky table. That $20 bill represents the entire philosophical thesis of Tyrone's journey. To the old Naomi, $20 was a completely meaningless sum, an amount she would carelessly drop on a single artisan coffee without a second thought. But to the new broken and rebuilding Naomi, that $20 bill represented hours of agonizing physical labor. It represented aching feet, burned hands, and the sheer willpower required to survive a day in the working class. When Tyrone looked into her exhausted eyes and told her that this was honest money and that she needed to learn to respect it, he was handing her the most valuable inheritance he could possibly provide. He was giving her back her dignity. He was offering her the singular key to her own salvation. When Naomi lowered her head and whispered her genuine gratitude, the transformation was officially solidified. She did not ask for a rescue. She did not demand a return to her luxury lifestyle. She accepted the money not as a handout from a billionaire, but as an earned wage from a customer. In that fleeting, profound moment, she was no longer a spoiled heiress demanding tribute from the world. She was a self-sufficient, grounded woman who finally understood the monumental weight and the profound sanctity of an honestly earned dollar. Tyrone had successfully purged the poison from her system. The surgery was brutal, the recovery was agonizing, but the patient had ultimately survived. We must all critically examine the dynamics of our own lives, our own families, and our own relationships through the lens of this story. We must ask ourselves if our fierce desire to protect the people we love is inadvertently destroying their capacity to survive the world. Are we providing a safety net, or are we constructing a hammock that encourages permanent stagnation? We must aggressively challenge the notion that financial comfort is the ultimate goal of human existence. Comfort without character is a recipe for moral decay. Wealth without accountability is a fast track to sociopathic entitlement. The story of Tyrone, Naomi, and Brent serves as a glaring, unavoidable warning beacon. It teaches us that the greatest act of love a parent, a partner, or a friend can offer is the courage to enforce strict, unyielding boundaries. True love demands that we allow our loved ones to face the fire, to endure the pain of their mistakes, and to forge their own strength in the relentless crucible of consequence. If we constantly rush in to save people from the fires they have intentionally started, we rob them of the opportunity to learn how to extinguish the flames themselves. The Gallagher family represents the absolute failure of this principle. Gregory and Evelyn protected Brent from his own failures for his entire life, covering up his inadequacies with money, influence, and false prestige. By refusing to let him fail, they created a monstrous, arrogant criminal who ultimately destroyed their entire legacy and drove them into complete, humiliating bankruptcy. Tyrone conversely represents the painful, necessary triumph of ultimate accountability. By refusing to save his daughter from the federal consequences of her theft, he effectively saved her soul. Let this narrative be a testament to the undeniable power of self-respect, the critical importance of maintaining boundaries, and the absolute necessity of hard, honest labor. We must never allow anyone, regardless of their relation to us, to treat us as a disposable resource. We must never confuse enabling toxic behavior with providing genuine love. And we must always remember that true power, the kind of power that cannot be bought, sold, or stolen, lies in the quiet, unshakable ability to walk away from disrespect and allow the universe to deliver its brutal, necessary lessons. If you have ever had to make the agonizing decision to cut off a toxic family member for your own survival, or if you have ever had to enforce a brutal boundary to teach someone a necessary lesson in accountability, you understand the exact weight of Tyrone's silent adjustment. It requires a monumental level of emotional fortitude to watch someone you love struggle through the consequences of their own actions. Yet, as this story brilliantly illustrates, it is often the only path to genuine redemption. Share your own experiences in the comments below. Tell us about a time when you had to enforce a harsh boundary with someone who underestimated your value. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that true respect is earned through honesty and accountability, not purchased with inherited wealth or manipulative lies. Join our community of strong, resilient individuals who refuse to be treated as stepping stones. See you in the next life story, where we will continue to explore the undeniable power of truth, dignity, and the ultimate triumph of self-respect.